Great, thank you. Okay, we will resume session here at 1:34 p.m. and we will have our informational budget and legislative session outcomes presentation. And welcome, Annalisa and Nancy and team.
So, Chair George, let me introduce this particular agenda item. Thank you. So we have to present today Nancy Bennett, who is our Policy and External Relations Manager, Annalisa Bhatia, who is our lead legislative coordinator, Matt Davis, who is our air quality policy lead in the director's office, Ryan Huff, who's the lead for water quality, and Abby Baderas, who is the lead for land quality. This team did a remarkable job during the last legislative session, the 2021 legislative session, and it was a remarkable legislative session. We're going to hear a little bit about that this afternoon. The legislature took a number of very significant policy steps by way of legislation that you'll hear about that touch on DEQ's and EQC's mission directly and indirectly. You'll hear a little bit about both of those, and also made historic levels of investment in Oregon communities across the state particularly around water and housing and recovery from the terrible Labor Day wildfires of last fall. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Nancy Bennett to introduce this item and the rest of the team to run you through the summary of what's happened over the last several months. But it really is both a remarkable accomplishment by the legislature and just a wonderful job by DEQ's team as well.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Richard. Director Whitman, I really appreciate it. And you said a lot of my introductory remarks already, which is great. So I won't introduce the team again, but I do want to just sort of mention what we're going to cover this afternoon. So we'll do a little bit of that high level context setting for the legislative session, sort of how things worked, and share some of the major budget highlights. The programs will give some more of those specifics, both budget and policy changes, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the unfinished business that we see, and then some of the next steps. So I'm actually going to ask Stephanie to go to the next slide. And we're going to, there we go. And we're going to start out with Annalisa talking about the session.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Chair George, members of the commission. For the record, my name is Annalist Bhatia. I'm DEQ Senior Legislative Advisor. I have to say, it's always nice to see everybody in this virtual world. It's wonderful to remember that we have friends and colleagues, so that's great. Since the last time that the OPA staff and myself have had the opportunity to speak to you, we've been through a whirlwind that was the 2021 legislative session. And as a setup to discussing the outcomes of that work, I always like to start with painting a little bit of a picture to the best of my ability of where things really stood as we went into this session. So I'm going to do that just a little bit. Starting off, you'll recall that the 2020 short session had ended with some legislators walking out. And since the legislature cannot pass bills without a quorum, that left many of the bills that had been up for consideration as not ultimately passing. And I think it's fair to say that in general, there was a lot of frustration on all sides that normally may have resolved a little bit as we went into a normal interim. Everyone can take a deep breath, have some different conversations, that sort of thing. But instead, we were all put into that which was March 2020. Instead of having some sort of break, legislators were immediately called back to multiple special sessions to address COVID response, economic support from the subsequent recession that we saw at that same time, and really to think about and talk about how the state was going to deal with those joint crises. And then as the summer progressed, we saw demonstrations happening in the state and across the country related to social justice issues, equity, questions of criminal justice reform. And then, of course, we had the Labor Day wildfires and statewide emergency response to that situation and making sure that we were taking care of the citizens and our neighbors who were impacted there. And to top it all off, it was a redistricting year coming into 2021. 2020 was a census year, you'll remember. So if it seems like I'm saying, and then another thing, and another thing, and another thing, that's absolutely true. All of these issues really on their own would be critical, important, and complicated conversations, but they were all on the table as what I would describe as must-do issues going into the 2021 session. And on top of all that, the legislature, as part of pandemic safety procedures, was operating remotely. So that meant regular office meetings, committee hearings, work sessions, any sort of work groups, those were all happening remotely, either through Zoom, through Teams. That also changed some of the procedures for what was required for notices for those committee hearings. It really had an impact in the pace and how all of this work was conducted. Only floor votes were conducted in person. An additional factor on top of everything else was that the group of legislators who were asked to do this work also contained a number of new faces. In the House, we had 8 new Democrats, 5 new Republicans, and in the Senate, we had 4 new Democrats and 2 new Republicans. So you can tell, especially if you've been tracking this for multiple sessions, that is a very significant group of new faces. And then they were asked to navigate the dynamic of being a new legislator and taking on a new role at a time that they didn't have the same access to their colleagues that they normally would have. You know, a lot of times their offices, they're next to each other, they can talk in the hallways, they can really have some of those conversations that are really important. And this time it was that much harder to do that. So you can see some of the reasons that this session was really unique. And I just want to take a second to echo the sentiments that have already been expressed and thank the rest of the OPA team, Nancy, Director Whitman, and all of the DEQ staff who supported us during this time. They joined in these remote meetings, they gave different informational presentations, and generally they're always incredibly supportive, but this time required an extra level of flexibility as we learned how to navigate doing this work in a new way. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody that was a part of that. I will say, despite the laundry list I've shared, the legislature was able to accomplish a level of work that is pretty comparable to what we normally see in a long session. There were a little over 2,500 bills, memorials, and resolutions introduced, a little over 700 of which actually ultimately passed and became law. And for those that passed right at the end of session, Governor Brown has until August 6th to veto any of those bills. So that's just a little bit of the timeline right now going forward. Of all of this work, DEQ tracks around 300 of those bills, many of which will be highlighted in the coming slides, and a good chunk of which did not ultimately pass. And then in addition to tracking all those and then giving testimonies when they were up for consideration, DEQ's programs, directors, administrators, staff gave a number of presentations to legislative committees related to the agency's past or ongoing work. Just highlighting again, there were a number of new faces, there were a number of new committees, there was a big restructuring of how different committees were set up and who served on what issue. And so there was a lot of opportunity to really put out informational sessions, really help bring everybody up to speed and do a lot of context setting for a lot of our work. So it was a great opportunity for us in that respect as well. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Nancy to kind of paint a picture of the budget conversations as part of all of this.
Great, thank you. And Stephanie, next slide. Okay, budget. So when I met with you in March, I talked a lot about the budget picture being this huge roller coaster over the past year. Annalise alluded to a bit of this, but early in the pandemic, we saw a major drop in lottery fund revenues. We had to make other one-time general fund cuts and to meet the governor's revenue targets. And so this really set the stage for us to have a very restrained agency request budget, which we submitted last fall. Right after that, of course, we had the catastrophic wildfire, which had at the time and continues to have, I think, significant budget implications. COVID was starting to surge again last winter. So, it really created, I think, this very grim mood around the state of the economy and the state budget as we entered the legislative session, earlier this year. Fast forward to late spring, two critical things happened, which I know you're all familiar with. One, Oregon, like all states, received a significant infusion of federal stimulus dollars, $2.6 billion, to address COVID and other priorities. And I think importantly, to assist in helping shore up the state budget because of some of the revenue declines we'd seen. But then actually on top of that, the May revenue forecast was far better than anybody anticipated. Showing not only, that future revenues were looking very good, but actually the state had an additional $1 billion to spend in the 1921 biennium. So that really changed the dynamic quite a bit. It started, we all were kind of entering this, what we thought would be a very painful cost-cutting exercise to, as one reporter put it, a spending bonanza. And that was really kind of the mood toward the end of the session. One unique feature to the budget, which I doubt will be repeated in the future, but you never know, is that each lawmaker got to direct an allotment toward projects in their own district. Those allotments were $4 million for senators and $2 million for House members. And so I think that created a lot of goodwill and kind of really helped keep the peace a bit in the session, and also I think fostered some collaboration among legislators around particular projects. So how did DEQ do? Our budget moved fairly late in the session. Overall, we saw a 26.2% increase in our budget and a 19% increase in general fund. We did not have to take any position reductions, so we were doing fairly well. We added about 50 new positions to the agency, and that includes new positions we got in our budget and then other pieces of legislation that added new work to our agency. Stephanie, next slide. I want to touch on some of the highlights in kind of all in one place so you can see it. The program staff are going to talk about some of these in more detail. But this just sort of gives you the big picture. So one, finally got our much needed ratification of our vehicle inspection fee increase, which restores 8 positions and provides some financial stability to the program. We added $1.3 million in general fund to our greenhouse gas climate protection program, which will be a really important piece of kind of bridging that work between, right now and when the program is really stood up. We added new positions and grant funding for wildfire. We renewed our funding for the on-site septic loan program, added 2 positions in our lab for our harmful algal bloom work. And typically we've gotten those as temporary positions, but we got permanent. So I think there's like more of an investment in that. We asked for 2, but actually got 4 positions in our clean watershed TMDL work. We were able to restore lost lottery funds and those positions. And we added 2 permit positions and $15 million for our on-site septic repair in potentially wildfire recovery areas. And then we added 11 new positions to support our central services division. So that just gives you kind of a flavor for how we've done. I want to mention also that, and I think Director Whitman alluded to this, that there was really an infusion of funding across natural resource agencies, sort of unlike we've seen. And I joined a meeting earlier this morning with other directors in Richard's place. And there was, really a lot of discussion around the coordination among natural resource agencies. And also just, I think we're all feeling there's a high level of expectation that we deliver results because there's a lot at stake in the work that we're doing, and we have to come together quickly and act quickly. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that in the months to come. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide and turn it to Matt.
Great. Good afternoon, Chair George and Commissioners. For the record, Matt Davis. It's really nice to see you all today. I think it's been a while since I've gotten to speak at an EQC meeting, so this is great. I'm going to walk through in a little more detail some of the outcomes that affected the Air Quality Division and Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs. I'll start on the left of the slide on the budget. Just generally speaking, the Air Quality Division did exceptionally well in terms of budget outcomes. The legislature approved all 5 policy option packages that were in our agency request budget. That included ratifying the fee for the vehicle inspection program and restoring 8 cut positions. It included baking in increased level of support that the state provides for LRAPA. That's the Lane Regional Air Protection Agency. That was really badly needed funding for that agency. An additional $1.4 million to support greenhouse gas emission reduction and climate work. A policy option package that authorized position and funding to fully implement House Bill 2007 from the 2019 session. That is the clean diesel bill that you all have adopted or are in the process of considering rules to implement. And then finally, a policy option package that authorized the first fee increase in the asbestos program in over 10 years. And the details of that fee increase will be worked out in a rulemaking that will ultimately come before you probably sometime in 2022. Outside of our resources that we sought, we also received a pretty big infusion of staff and funding related to wildfire smoke. So this is kind of bridging the budget and policy boxes on the slide, but Senate Bill 762 passed, I think, the very last day of session. It was the legislature's comprehensive wildfire mitigation and readiness bill. It affected almost a dozen state agencies and provided over $150 million in funding. DEQ specifically received 7 new positions as part of that bill, and I'll just talk briefly about the work that we are directed to complete with them. The first is the legislature directed DEQ to establish and run a grant program that will support local communities in their smoke readiness planning. They appropriated $1.5 million to that grant fund for this next biennium and authorized a position to help coordinate and oversee those grants, which is really fantastic. The Air Quality Division has been kind of increasingly being tasked with running grant programs and issuing incentives and that type of work, and we had badly needed a coordinator position, so that's a big deal for the division. That bill also provided 2 positions that are intended to kind of directly support local governments in collecting, interpreting, and communicating the air quality impacts of smoke. So we are, as you would expect, get inundated with questions and requests for various types of support from communities during the wildfire season. And up until now, we really didn't have dedicated staff resources to do that work. And then finally, from this bill, the laboratory received 4 positions and funding that will support a number of different things. Most importantly, a dedicated meteorologist to help our perform the smoke forecasts that we do, staff to build and deploy additional smoke monitors throughout the state, and also staff to support community science work. And that's something we've talked about with the commission in the past, that our laboratory, as air quality monitoring equipment is becoming cheaper and more accessible, we are getting a lot of questions from organizations in the public about what kind of monitor they should buy, where should they put it, what does the data mean, questions that these positions will be kind of dedicated to responding to, which is great. I'm just going to walk through a few more bill highlights here. So the next is House Bill 2165, which is Governor Brown's transportation electrification bill. Among other things, the bill repeals the sunset on the electric vehicle rebate program, which previously had been slated to end in 2024. The bill also doubles the value of the charge ahead rebate. That's the income qualified rebate from $2,500 to $5,000, and then makes another changes to the program statutes that ultimately will allow it to better serve lower income and rural communities across the state. So we work very closely with a coalition of supporters in the governor's office on that bill, and are really excited that the state now has a EV rebate program with no sunset. The next bill I want to talk about is House Bill 2021. So among other things, kind of the most prominent feature of the bill is that it requires the state's two largest electric utilities to provide 100% clean power by 2040, with interim targets in 2030 and 2035. And the bulk of that part of the bill will be implemented by the Public Utility Commission, the regulatory body for those entities, but the emissions verification function of that work will continue to be managed by DEQ staff. And this isn't necessarily or substantial kind of new work for DEQ, but it's a bill that's really important to mention because of its complementary nature to the proposed climate protection program. And as staff have discussed with you over the last 6 months, we do not anticipate our proposed rules related to that program to cover greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector because of limitations to your authorities. But this bill addresses that gap. And to the extent that our economy electrifies as we transition away from fossil fuels, House Bill 2021 assures that that transition will support our climate goals by eliminating all greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity. So this is a really important piece of legislation in the climate policy space, and again addresses a key gap that you have been hearing about related to the climate protection program. So. In that same policy space, House Bill 2475, again, not direct impacts to DEQ, but impacts to work that we care about. That bill directs the Public Utilities Commission to kind of make a variety of changes in the way they regulate electric utilities, that support low-income communities. It will allow them to establish differential rates for low-income communities and also provided funding for environmental justice communities to participate more fully in the rate-setting process that the PUC oversees. And then finally, I want to talk, I want to mention that pollution from cars and trucks and diesel equipment received pretty significant time and attention, particularly in the House Committee on Energy and Environment. There were a suite of bills. One identified a sustainable revenue stream for our existing clean diesel engine fund. One would have banned the sale of fossil diesel throughout the state. One bill directed DEQ to study diesel emissions, black carbon emissions, and identify mitigation strategies. And another bill directed the department to study approaches to reducing diesel emissions that are associated with indirect sources. And ultimately, none of these bills were made it kind of through Ways and Means or were adopted by the legislature. But to me, it's a signal that it's a topic that continues to be of interest, particularly in those committees. And I would expect we'll be talking about some of those issues in sessions to come. So that's all I have. I think I'll ask Stephanie to advance the slide and turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, Chair George and commissioners. Good to see you all. For the record, my name is Ryan Huff, and I'm here to talk about the outcomes from the session for our water quality programs. Of the 75 or so water quality related policy bills that we were tracking this session, 18 have either been enacted or are awaiting the governor's signature. There's only a couple of these bills that directly touch on DEQ program activities, and I'll discuss the most significant of those in a moment. But most of them are directed at sister agencies or others' activities and may only have minimal or indirect effect on our programs. As such, I'm going to focus my time more specifically on budget outcomes that have implications for our water quality work, or more broadly, provide investments that support water quality improvement objectives. So of the 8 policy option packages that we had submitted as part of our agency request budget, 4 of those were authorized and funded. First of all, one related to our clean watershed plans, which Nancy noted earlier. The policy option package had been recommended in the governor's recommended budget at a 50% funding level, but the legislature ended up funding this in full. And so that involves one position to increase our capacity for TMDL development work, and 3 positions that generally support TMDL implementation efforts around the state, but also some that are specificically focused in the Willamette Basin. The package also includes some contract services funding to improve our ability to do status and trend modeling, analysis and characterization of conditions using data from remote sensing and other related technologies. Another package authorizes use of the Clean Water State Revolving Funds admin funds for the procurement of loan portfolio management software, which will replace the program's manual and outdated systems with a more secure system that's going to increase efficiency and improve customer services related to administering those loans. Another package restores funding and positions associated with what had been anticipated reductions for lottery funds. However, based on latest revenue forecasts, there's now projected to be sufficient Measure 76 lottery fund dollars to be able to restore that funding. And by approving this package, the department's going to be able to continue ongoing water quality monitoring activities and be able to support some of our non-point source pollution reduction efforts that otherwise we would have had to cut. And also there was a package approved in our budget that includes or allows DEQ to continue to issue general obligation bonds and pay debt service on those bonds in a manner that enables us to accept Clean Water State Revolving Fund capitalization grants from the federal government to support this program. So this authorization is important and necessary to ensure that we can continue providing communities with affordable financing options for wastewater treatment and other clean water projects. Some other significant budget developments for our water quality programs include changes to the hydroelectric facilities fee structure and the resulting revenue that supports DEQ's 401 water quality certification work associated with these projects. House Bill 2143 had originally proposed a revised fee structure that would have provided sufficient revenue to support current service level activities of our 2 FTE program, as well as related efforts at Water Resources Department and ODFW. A negotiated amendment of this bill that was enacted involves a delayed fee increase for some of those facilities. And as a result, DEQ would have faced about a $420,000 revenue shortfall to support our continued service levels this biennia. However, the legislature did provide a one-time general fund appropriation as part of the end of session omnibus bill that addresses that shortfall and allows our program to maintain its activities through this biennia until the full fee increase takes effect in 2024. With regard to harmful algal blooms, the House Water Committee had sponsored 2 bills this session that reflected recommendations from a legislative work group that they had initiated by the committee in 2019. One of those bills aims to increase capacity for cyanotoxin and harmful algal bloom monitoring and testing activities. The funding for 2 new positions and some new equipment to do this work were approved actually mid-session as part of the 2019-2021 budget reconciliation bill. And this was done to allow us to get a head start on those efforts during this HAB season, rather than having to wait until next year to implement those resources. So ongoing funds to support these positions and allow testing from a wider variety of water bodies across the state. Those resources were then rolled up into our budget bill for 21, 23, and beyond. Also included in our budget bill is an appropriation of $2 million in general fund, which will allow us to reestablish the on-site septic repair and replacement loan program that had first been established in 2016 and is authorized under ORS 454.770. Between 2017 and 2020, DEQ had distributed over 1.7 million in general fund pass-through funding to Craft 3, a nonprofit CDFI that had been awarded the contract to administer this loan program. Craft 3 had successfully leveraged that funding with other funds to provide over 3.5 million in low interest loans to Oregonians that needed non-traditional loan services to address failing septic systems on their property. But without additional sources of funding to capitalize the program, it had been put on hold over the past year or so. So we're really looking forward to being able to ramp up these efforts again. I'd also like to highlight what could be characterized as a couple of new initiatives that were directed to DEQ's water quality programs. And these came through to us as part of the end of session omnibus bill, House Bill 5006. First and perhaps most significant, the legislature directed $15 million of ARPA funds to DEQ to provide financial assistance to public agencies or qualified institutions for repair and replacement, upgrade or evaluation of residential or other on-site septic systems. So this is certainly related to, but distinct from the $2 million loan program appropriation that is authorized under ORS 454.770 that I just described. This new bucket of funding differs in that it is somewhat more broad in terms of applicability, both in terms of eligible recipients for the funding, as well as our ability to offer a broader range of financial assistance options, which may include, but are not limited to, loans. So DEQ is going to need to determine the most effective strategy and most efficient approach for distributing these funds, which may be applied to residential or large on-site septic system needs. And it may include grants, low interest loans, forgivable loans, or a combination thereof. To implement this work, the legislature did approve over $550,000 in general fund for the agency on a one-time basis for us to hire 2 new limited duration positions to help administer this program. That'll help provide coordination, outreach, and assistance to some of the local entities who may be good candidates to utilize this funding. The second new initiative to note is the appropriation of $350,000 in general fund for contract services to begin the initial scoping and design of a database framework for statewide water and infrastructure data. While this is provided as a one-time appropriation, this is likely to become a fairly significant information technology project that would require additional funding requests in the future, and certainly will require extensive interagency coordination and stakeholder engagement. So Stephanie, next slide, please. So in addition to these DEQ specific investments, the legislature also approved a range of other major investments related to water, water infrastructure, and water resource management across the state, as has already been referenced a couple of times today. All told, legislative champions and truly all of us are celebrating what seems to be a grand total of over $538 million in water-related investments across the state. Although DEQ is only directly involved in a relatively small subset of these initiatives that I mentioned on the previous slide, the implications of many of these other project investments will most certainly have positive implications on our work, indirectly, if not directly. I believe I've provided a link in your packet of materials to a summary list of funding initiatives that was put out by the Senate President's Office, providing more detail on this, but I do want to just briefly highlight a couple of these categories of investments. Specifically related to water quality work, Commissioner Kyle already mentioned in her opening remarks this morning some of those investments that have been made at OWEB, specifically regarding riparian and floodwater restoration work focused on some of the wildfire affected areas. I also want to note some specific funding for ODA regarding implementation of agriculture water quality work, including support for a new position to help them work with small watersheds, conduct assessments for compliance with ag water quality rules, and also some additional funding so that they can work with local partners, SWCDs, watershed councils, and others to provide technical support and help establish new strategic implementation areas across the state. There was also about $500,000 investment in groundwater work, specifically related to the lower Umatilla area. And then perhaps the largest and most significant category can broadly be characterized under the banner of water infrastructure. Certainly our over $17 million in investments for DEQ for on-site septic repair and replacement are included in this category. But there's an extensive list of over $275 million in designated funding for site-specific public drinking water and wastewater treatment system upgrades for communities really, truly all across the state. Other categories include funding for planning, place-based planning and locally led water planning projects around the state, funding to update the integrated water resources strategy. It was last updated in 2017. There's a category, $46 million devoted to regional and basin-specific projects. Includes things like dam safety improvements and irrigation conservation projects. Another category of over 40 million investments for water supply and quantity work. Much of this related to water supply development grants and loans that will be involved with evaluating and implementing in-stream and out-of-stream water development projects. About $6 million related to resiliency work that applies to dam safety engineering and risk assessments, as well as some work for climate change adaptation. Another category of over 11 million related to data collection, technology and modernization efforts, applied to both surface and groundwater data collection equipment, support for groundwater studies. And then lastly, also just wanted to call out that specific category that Nancy already mentioned regarding some of the legislator-specific dedicated funding. Some of that we've been able to identify as being specifically water quality related or benefits related to water quality work. And this includes things such as $1 million for addressing houseless relocation efforts within Greenway urban campgrounds that are affecting riparian degradation down in the Medford area. Another $1 million devoted to cleaning up abandoned boats in the lower Willamette River. So again, this is just intended to be a brief sampling and a few examples of an otherwise expansive list of water-related investments made by the state during the final days of the session, and really promise to support a variety of water quality protection and water quality improvement activities. So that's the extent of the water-specific summary that I have time to provide today. So be happy to answer any questions as time allows, but otherwise we'll pass the baton here, so to speak, over to Abby.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Will you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay, somebody?
We hear you great.
Thank you, Chair. Next slide, please. Great. Thank you. So thanks, everyone. I'm Abby Baduris, Legislative Analyst for the Land Quality Division. Nice to see all of you, even if we're still in these little rectangles. Take it for now. So I'll start on the budget side of the Land Quality Program. And I guess I'll preface first with, it was a very, very active session for the Land Quality Division and very successful, with one exception that I will point out as I go along. So to start, the policy option package for the Industrial Orphan Program was approved. So we will receive the requested authorization and limitation for a portion of 10.3 million general obligation bonds to replenish that account. And so replenishing the Industrial Orphan Site account will fund ongoing investigation and cleanup of contaminated sites where uncontrolled hazardous substance releases pose a risk to human health and the environment, and where no other source of funding is available to address that risk. So we're really happy to see that work be able to continue. We're also successful with the POP to make 2 limited duration positions into permanent positions to work on the solid waste orphan program. Back in 2019, we got those positions as limited duration to explore how we could better utilize the solid waste orphan fund, and that proved very successful. So now that work will be able to continue. That work relies on existing funding source that are paid on the disposal of solid waste in Oregon. Also successful in the budget category was Senate Bill 57 and the corresponding POP. That updates the fees charged on the disposal of hazardous waste at Oregon's only hazardous waste landfill. That bill removes some obsolete fees and increased funding that partially supports our hazardous waste and our environmental cleanup programs. The passage of the recycling bill, more on that in a minute, comes with 6 new positions and funding for that program. And then finally, in the not as good news, as we've discussed with the Commission numerous times over the past years, the emergency response program needs additional staff and funding. And unfortunately, we did not receive funding in that arena. So I imagine we will continue to talk with all of you as we develop a budget again, as we start that all over again soon. But the big news is Senate Bill 582, the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, and it passed. It's a comprehensive update to the entire recycling system in Oregon. Really just thrilled to be able to report this. Several other states did run similar bills with only Oregon and Maine's passing. So really it's putting Oregon back on the map as a leader in recycling. I'll go a little bit more into detail, although I think we'll probably need more time in the future to really dive deep here. We started this, as you might remember, over 3 years ago in responses to the challenges with the recycling markets. So we convened the Recycling Steering Committee to consider solutions and make a recommendation to modernize our decades-old system. And the goal was to optimize environmental benefits, create a resilient system, and restore and maintain public trust in that system. We drafted a legislative concept based on that proposal and continued discussions with committee members and many other interested parties as we went along. That was House Bill 2065. That was the bill submitted on behalf of DEQ by the governor. So it started as a House bill, but early on it was decided to stuff the contents of that bill into a Senate bill under the direction of Senator Lee Byer. So it became Senate Bill 582. And it took 2065 and it added amendments that would worked on with many stakeholders over the interim months. I'll just point out a little bit of process, mostly to give you a sense of how robust the conversation was in the Capitol on this topic. There were 4 public hearings in Senate Energy and Environment Committee with substantial amendments that were worked on in the process to address concerns. And then there was further discussion in Ways and Means Committee in addition to amendments in that process. We got through the House and the Senate at the very end of June, kind of in the waning days there, with really great support and momentum from Senator Byer and Representative Solomon, who both showed really strong leadership on the bill. So now with good company, the bill is in the governor's office awaiting signature. Once we're past that, the bill will become effective on January 1st of this coming year. So from a high level, this is what the legislation is going to do to address the key challenges in our system. To address public confusion, it will provide better education and create one statewide recycling collection list. To improve inequities throughout the system, it sets up a system that better meets the needs of unserved and underserved communities, particularly rural communities and multifamily housing residents. Where there was no producer funding to support the recycling system, now producers will be obligated to share responsibility with local governments and ratepayers. And to address the trend in Oregon of creating more garbage and recycling less over time, the legislation will increase the quantity and quality of recycling as it becomes easier and more accessible throughout the state. And where we now have no guarantee of responsible recycling, the new law requires producers and recycling processors to ensure that the material collected for recycling is actually recycled in ways that protect human health and the environment. The Recycling Modernization Act achieves these solutions and more. It creates a shared responsibility recycling system that builds on the parts of our programs that work well, and it fills gaps where we needed an improvement. It uses elements of extended producer responsibility that makes producers of packaging and paper products responsible for their products for the first time. And it does more than support recycling. It actually advances recycling and related activities in ways that aligns with the Material Management Program's 2050 vision that seeks to conserve resources, protect the environment, and enhance well-being for everyone in Oregon and beyond. So we got past that. Now the work really begins. We will begin implementation and planning in earnest in August. After we take a little bit of a deep breath from all the activity that got us here. Key stakeholders will be involved in the implementation and planning, and there also will be formal opportunities where interested parties can be involved, such as rulemaking. We will be in front of you with a number of rulemakings. There's also a truth in labeling task force, an ongoing advisory committee, and there'll be public comment periods related to the plans, plan amendments, and annual reports. This will be a multi-year process of planning and implementation. So a couple things for the right ahead. To give you a sense, though, there will be 4 years to build this foundational work, and then the program will begin in July of 2025. We'll be hiring several positions starting in January, so 6 positions to start. There will be one of the first things outward facing will be a truth in labeling task force with a report that's due next June. So that will be right out of the gate. We'll be doing a statewide needs assessment of local government interest in expanding collection service, and that will be due in 23. The Producer Responsibility Organization or organizations, those are the people who will implement this on behalf of producers, will need to form by early 2024. And then they need to implement by 2025. The equity studies and multifamily studies and litter studies will begin as well. So just want to kind of land at the end here with the important role that the commission will have in rulemaking that will really put a lot of the meat on the bones of kind of how this program will work. And I look forward to coming before you to talk about that or more details of the bill to meet your interests. So I will pass the baton on now. Thank you.
And can we go to the next slide, Stephanie? And so we've got about 3 more slides, and I know we only have about 9 minutes, so we're going to move through this fairly quickly. And Annalisa, do you want to start?
Absolutely. And I just add for the ones that especially we are moving quickly for, if you want more details, there is the written report that was also included in the meeting materials. So the commissioners and the public can find more details there. So we did want to highlight a couple agency management bills. These are typically the bills that operate or impact how we operate as an agency, or that may impact our work across the different media divisions. One I want to mention is Senate Bill 58. This was one of DEQ's specific bills that we developed and we brought to the legislature. And it was designed to give DEQ the ability to recoup the costs for the licensing and hosting costs of the environmental data management system, or your DEQ Online. So that created the mechanism. We have the authority to do this. The bill was passed successfully and it was incorporated into our budget. House Bill 3372 was a bill that was introduced by the Speaker and is aimed at clarifying and increasing DEQ's authority to consider different situations when a permit applicant has a particularly egregious history of noncompliance with environmental requirements. So just as a little bit of background here, currently, the agency has general authority when we are considering issuing, modifying, suspending, or revoking a permit that allows us to deny an application to do any of those things or take other action based on a history of enforcement violations for some of our programs. This authority is really, really critical to our work and in any of those programs that are federally delegated, because that authority needs to be consistent with federal requirements. But that being said, the existing language was a little vague and didn't apply to all situations. So for example, it didn't include all of DEQ's programs. So we could consider some violations, but not all violations. House Bill 3372 clarified that existing authority by including all DEQ programs and authorities, so we can consider all of those things. It also included language articulating key factors that DEQ will consider as it's considering taking action using this authority, related to the violation itself or the permittee or the applicant's subsequent actions as part of that overall consideration. It didn't restrict our authority, but it'll serve as guideposts and different touch points as we're doing that decision making. So that will be something that as we move towards implementation, we're going to work into our existing work. I will now turn it back to Nancy to talk about environmental justice.
Yes, and I want to highlight this briefly. I know the Commission has a lot of interest in environmental justice. The legislature passed this resolution with strong bipartisan support. It's a resolution, so it doesn't have policy directives, but I think a lot of advocates saw this as an opportunity to establish a framework of principles on environmental justice and sort of have this sense of the legislature's support for this. But it's really just sort of, it is just that framework and those principles, and it needs to be followed up with concrete action. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. I've already talked about the new positions that we got in our Central Services Division, again, being very important to support kind of the core work of the agency. We get a lot of policy positions, but we don't always get the sort of payroll and IT and HR folks that help us kind of keep things running smoothly. So we're very pleased to actually get authorization for these new positions. Those are funded through indirect. And then finally, it has been mentioned that we were authorized to proceed with these bond sales to support our Clean Water SRF program and our industrial orphan sites. Next slide. So thinking a little bit about unfinished business, environmental justice being, again, one, we were really disappointed that the governor's environmental justice bill, Senate Bill 286, did not pass. We did not get the resources in our budget to support this work, although that doesn't mean work is not happening at the agency. And I know we plan to bring an item to the commission later this year to talk more about that. But I do think seeking resources for this work will be a top priority for us in future sessions. And there are ongoing conversations with the governor's office and other agency directors about, what we can be doing in our own agencies, and also looking at developing a shared mapping tool that would enhance how we assess environmental burdens across Oregon. What's interesting to me is that there's a broad swath of agencies involved in this conversation. So everybody from ODOT to Housing and Community Services, Health Authority, Department of Energy. So really looking at this issue more holistically, which I think is really great and a good step forward. Abby talked a little bit about emergency response being kind of our perennial issue that, we just cannot seem to break through with the legislature on this one in terms of getting the general fund resources we need. There was a bill, House Bill 3269 by Representative Hudson, who's a new rep, to study this issue. And I think that may be a strategy that we take forward, which is to actually first start with kind of a study of the need and then kind of come back with a clear plan on funding. So we're going to be, again, looking at different ways to address this. I want to touch on lab infrastructure briefly. This is something that kind of gets buried a little bit in our budget, but we really want to bring it forward, I think, as a critical issue. One being we need to invest capital infrastructure. We have a lot of aging equipment that needs to be replaced. We have, a really growing staff at our lab, but not enough sort of management folks to kind of help that. So we have some needs there. And then just sort of the supplies to run the laboratory successfully. The formula, the way the state does a formula, doesn't really work for the lab, which has very unique supply needs that are very expensive. So I think we're going to be highlighting this issue. You're going to hear more about that from us in the, as we work on our next budget. I'm going to turn over to Ryan for a quick comment about the next two items.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So earlier in our presentation, I mentioned that the House Water Committee had sponsored two bills this session related to harmful algal blooms, but only noted the passage of one of those, the one related to increased capacity for monitoring and testing. The second HABs related bill would have provided direction to DEQ and dedicated funding to our watershed management section to analyze available data and develop water body specific harmful algal bloom management strategies to aim to reduce the occurrence or severity of these events. This bill did pass out of committee and was referred to Ways and Means, but was not funded. So as we implement a more robust monitoring effort that's based upon the funding that was approved, and we start to gather additional data on HAB occurrences and potential contributing factors, we will continue to explore options for establishing the dedicated analytical resources that the stakeholder group has recommended. So I think more to come on that discussion as well. And then I believe Nancy also wanted me to address the status of water quality permitting work. As you know, in 2019, DEQ worked closely with a variety of stakeholders to pass a package of general fund and fee revenue to fund a portion of the new staffing needs that are required to right-size our wastewater permitting and on-site program activities. This includes eliminating a backlog of outdated permits, establishing a framework for being able to consistently issue quality permits in a timely manner, and conducting the type of monitoring and compliance assurance activities that are critical for a well-functioning permitting program. So policy option packages 120 and 122 from this last agency request budget were designed to be a second installment of what was expected to be a multi-biennia investment strategy. But the fee increases proposed or would be needed to support those resources were likely a hill too steep to climb during the uncertain economic circumstances that we've all been operating under. So we will have to wait and pursue that second installment of investments at another time. So again, sort of more to come on that topic as well.
Of course, my cat is making an appearance. I really hoped I could get through this meeting without the cat meowing. Okay, so finally, diesel investments. So, Matt talked about, the interest from the legislature. I think what we didn't see from the legislature was actually investing sort of new resources, whether, that's around retrofits or, I think also are really looking at a space where we electrify, particularly medium duty fleets, and thinking about, what are the incentives and infrastructure that are needed to make this a viable option. So I see that as being something we'll be bringing back to you. Let's go to the next slide. And this will be our final slide. And special session roll, Annalisa.
So one item that was not able to be accomplished during the regular session was the redistricting process I mentioned. The legislature has until September 27th to finalize the new maps that are needed to reflect the population change for the 90 legislative districts and what's expected to be 6 congressional districts. Part of this is because the Census Bureau was late in getting that population information to the states. That is supposed to come in mid-August. And so even before the end of long session, it was already announced that a special session was going to be called in late September. That is currently scheduled for September 20th. So they're giving themselves not very long to make these considerations. Normally it's about a 3-month process, so it'll be a pretty quick turnaround, but that session is on the table and scheduled for around legislative days. Given that tight turnaround right now, it's unclear if any other issues will be raised during the special session, but I think it's always a possibility until it's not anymore. So it's something we'll be waiting with bated breath to see what happens.
Great. And a couple more things to quickly mention. So we just passed our 21-23 budget, but believe it or not, it's time to start thinking about the 23-25, which I can barely say. But it really is, we start the planning process for that now. We'll be bringing ideas to you, probably starting early next year. And then about a year from now, we'll be submitting that next agency request budget. So having you think about that. I think, another quick mention is continued focus on racial justice. Mentioning that because there was a lot of conversation around that this session, and I think they made some good gains, especially in police accountability and some other issues. And I think we'll see a greater focus on this in the state legislative process. We have a more diverse legislature. We have a newly re-energized BIPOC caucus. And I think a strong commitment from the governor in her last, 18 months here. I think we will continue to see more focus and attention on that. And I think DEQ will be involved in a lot of those conversations. And then just want to mention, we're going to have an election next year and we're going to have a new governor. And so that process, we'll be putting our agency request budget together, and I'm sure the current governor will be sort of helping guide that, but then it'll be turned over to somebody new. And so we'll be dealing with those decisions, and just those are things that we're thinking about right now. So I know we're wrapping up kind of quickly here and are over time, but if there are questions for the team, I want to give you a chance to ask those.
Yes, we are a little bit over time, but if we do have some urgent or important questions or comments, let's take those now. Vice Chair Barrasso.
This is just because it's nagging at me. What happens? I mean, first, just huge congratulations. I'm blown away at the year that it was in terms of passing all this legislation that has been. It reflects a lot of pent-up demand of years of this not happening. So just kudos to everyone that was moving all of this. I can't imagine what that looked like on your end. But I appreciate that infusion of federal resources that made some of this work possible. What happens after this biennium and this funding we have? What happens in the next biennium? We've increased and so I don't need to ask more. I'll keep my question simple.
Well, I'll take a quick stab at answering that, and perhaps Director Whitman wants to weigh in on that as well. I mean, some of the positions we got were limited duration, so that will have to come back, I think, and make the case for making those permanent. I think the Wildfire is a good example of that, where that work isn't going to end, obviously, in the next 18 months, and so. But the state forecast predicted, I think, fairly robust revenues for the next couple of biennia. So I think but it's hard to be confident in that right now because it's been such a seesaw. So I think we will just sort of have to keep taking it year by year. It's my opinion, but if anyone else wants to chime in on that.
Chair George.
Yes, Director.
Thank you. I will chime in a little bit. So I think a couple of things. One is we are likely to see some contraction in available resources in the 23-25 biennium. It's just the wave of federal and state dollars and combined with high revenue levels for the state is, I think, unlikely to continue forever. The federal American Relief Act dollars do have a longer time frame. They continue. They don't have to be spent until October 1 of 2025. So we've got a 4-year window to get ARPA dollars out the door to communities. So we've got a little bit of a longer time frame on that. But I think in terms of DEQ staffing, we can't assume that the great revenue picture that we currently see is going to continue forever. So, and with a number of these positions being limited duration, I don't think we can assume that all of them are going to be made permanent. So there is going to be a need to manage this with that kind of reduction in resourcing in mind. In terms of dollars for investment in infrastructure, specifically capital dollars, that's a bigger long-term conversation with both the Oregon legislature and Congress. And of course, we still have some form of federal infrastructure bill that probably will include funding for water quality and drinking water infrastructure as part of that, along with transportation and other infrastructure to come. And so part of this is getting the federal government really back in the business of making major investments in public infrastructure around water. And that's where working with our delegation, and in particular our Senate delegation, where we have Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden in leadership positions and really able to influence potentially federal policy, I think is the longer term answer. I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yeah, Chair George, while wildfire has dominated the news this summer, I noticed we did get 2 new lab positions for the algal bloom. And I haven't heard, are we having algal bloom problems this summer? I'd be interested to know.
Chair George, Commissioner Mosby, we are seeing some early signs of harmful algal bloom problems, not affecting any drinking water supplies that I'm aware of at this point, but in some of the recreational lakes, we are seeing some early outbreaks, which is not surprising in not just in Oregon, but in other states across the country.
Thank you. Well, and once again, I just have to add my voice to the chorus of thanking the DEQ team, and a tremendous job done this year. This is such an impressive list of accomplishments for this session, and we know that you guys are scrambling and working hard right down to the very end. But truly, DEQ's accomplishments this year are just tremendously impressive. And I think part of that too is the team that's been built up here, bringing these professionals to the table and empowering these people to develop the relationships, to carry the messages, and to provide our decision makers with the information they need. And when that is done skillfully, we really can accomplish a great deal. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get our update on the Climate Protection Program.
All right, Chair George, for the record, this is Richard Whitman, Oregon DEQ Director. I'm going to give a very brief introduction again for this particular agenda item and then quickly turn it over to the experts. We have Colin McConaughey, the manager of the Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs here today, and he is joined by Nicole Singh, our Senior Climate Policy Advisor for the program. They, along with their team of professional staff, have been doing just outstanding work on this really important rulemaking around reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. I will introduce this by just noting where we're at in the process and where we're headed. This is the last commission meeting we will have before the department puts out draft proposed rules for a public comment period, and including a couple of public hearings. We are expecting there'll be an opportunity for the commission to hold a public hearing as part of the public process to receive input on these rules. But we are at an important point in the development of the program, given that we're about to put out kind of the first draft of what the program will look like to the public. So we are expecting, as part of public forum, following this presentation from staff, you're probably going to hear a fair number of folks wanting to comment on the program. And I think the last thing I want to, well, a couple of last things. One, just recall that in order to get this program going on the time frame that Oregon Governor Brown has asked us to do, we need to adopt these rules by the end of this calendar year. And so as a reminder for commissioners, that means we likely will be having an additional meeting of the Environmental Quality Commission sometime in the first half of December to consider the final proposed rules. So that's just a process point for you all. And the last thing I want to say is, with regard to something you heard about in the prior agenda item, the passage of House Bill 2021. Again, that bill establishes the policies in statute for us to get to 100% clean, renewable electricity in Oregon. And that is really a key complement to the climate protection program, because when you think about how are we going to get to an 80 or a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon, a lot of that comes down to moving how we produce energy or how we use energy from fossil fuels to renewable electricity. There are some other types of renewable energy, such as renewable natural gas, potentially hydrogen, that are part of the picture. But right now, the big lever, if you will, is getting transportation and getting home heating, getting industry off of fossil fuels as much as possible and onto renewable sources of electricity. So the passage of House Bill 2021 was a really critical component of this overall effort by Oregon to get to a clean energy future. And we have been working very closely with the Public Utilities Commission. We will continue to work very closely with them to really have an integrated program across our agencies to get to the level of greenhouse gas reductions that we are seeing that not just Oregon, but all parts of the world need to get to in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Colin and Nicole to give you more detail about where we're at in our part of that effort, the Climate Protection Program.
Great. Thank you, Director Whitman. Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Colin McConaughey. I manage our Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs, as Richard just mentioned. And I'm going to go through the first few slides here before I hand it over to Nicole. Could we go to the next slide, please? So just, and I'm going to launch here real quick because I know we're time constrained and we have a lot of material to get through. So the Climate Protection Program, just as a reminder, this is a program that is designed to set, for the first time, enforceable limits on greenhouse gas emissions across fossil fuels, primarily across nearly all end uses of fossil fuels within the state of Oregon, and to have those limits not just be enforceable overall, but also decline over time towards those greenhouse gas reduction limits that science says we need to hit as a global community to avoid those worst effects of climate change. And so what that means is these new limits would be established over, again, fossil fuels, including transportation, gasoline and diesel used in our transportation sector. That's our largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon, as it is in so many parts of the world. But it also includes other uses of diesel, such as boilers and construction equipment. It includes natural gas used to heat homes and businesses, as well as propane, kerosene, and other fossil fuels. So that's just at the highest level what this program is shaping up, and the proposal that you will see from us at the end of the year will propose we establish. Just a quick note, we had our final Rules Advisory Committee meeting just earlier this month on July 8th. Next slide, explain a little bit more here on our timeline. So having concluded our Rules Advisory Committee phase, as Director Whitman just mentioned, what that means is we will be very shortly issuing a set of proposed rules for public comment. We hope to do that very early next month. and set off a 60-day comment period. And toward the end of that, we intend to hold a couple public hearings. Again, hopefully one of those will be hosted by the Environmental Quality Commission. And at the conclusion of that public comment period in early October, we will then respond to comments, finalize the rule proposal in response to that input and those comments, and provide a full rule package as no doubt each of you are familiar with receiving how that works with the staff report and the fiscal impact statement. That will come in November with the plan again for a special meeting of the Environmental Quality Commission then in December in time for then if the commission adopts those rules for this new program to take effect at the start of next year. Next slide, please. So just real quickly here, just almost serves kind of as an outline for the rest of this slide deck. Some of the key program issues that we've been working through with our Rules Advisory Committee from the start of this year. And really, I want to also note that we had a robust stakeholder engagement process that in which we discussed these same issues for the latter half of last year as well, before going into the rulemaking process. And some of the key issues here that we'll be discussing further again today, and some of these will sound familiar. We've discussed some of these with the commission in your past meetings as well. First and foremost, kind of fundamentally, is what emissions is this program covering, and what entities are going to be responsible for those emissions and for reducing those emissions. So just as a preview, what we're looking at doing is to, again, have this program establish limits overall on nearly all fossil fuels used in the state. And that we think an effective point of regulation for those fuels are not all the individual users, all of us driving around and heating our homes, but rather way upstream at the entities that first bring those fuels into the state. So that's the type of issue there we've been discussing with stakeholders, is where do we place the point of regulation, as we would refer to it. And then another fundamental element of this program, of course, is that cap, the overall limit that we set. Where do we start it off at, and where do we take it from there? How fast does it go down? And then a number of important cost containment and really measures to, we think, improve the equitable outcomes of this program, and how it brings some of Oregon's most disadvantaged, low income, and historically subject to some of the worst environmental effects of Oregon communities. How do we help have this, as a part of this program, those communities transition to that clean energy future faster and more easily? So the big one there for us is the community climate investments component that we've again discussed with the commission a couple times now already. And then we also want to talk about how this program, in addition to covering all those fossil fuel suppliers that I've mentioned, how it also may include a more bespoke, source-specific regulatory approach for a couple handfuls of very mostly unique sources of large industrial emissions across the state. I'm going to hand it over to Nicole here. I do want to just quickly mention for the commission that, again, I know we're time constrained. We got a late start here, and there's so much to this program to cover. Just want to really encourage the commission, if we're going to be moving intentionally very fast through these slides, to slow us down, stop us if there's something that we've glossed over. You just want to spend more time discussing with us and have us elaborate. Please don't hesitate to interrupt and have us slow down. But with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Nicole to keep the pace going.
I think that's a great suggestion, Colin. I'm just jumping in for a second. And because we have had much discussion of this, I would invite you folks that if you think something's really, largely been covered before, to go ahead and you can skip over a few things, and then that way we'll use the time for the things that people really want to discuss. So I'll leave that to your discretion, but knowing we've had this some of this conversation before, I invite you to feel free to do that and spend the time where you think it's best invested. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair George. I think that actually is Nicole's plan to skip over a few of these slides. So Stephanie, you may be on the hook to skip over a couple of these. So thank you. Nicole?
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Chair George and Vice Chair and Commissioners. Again, we did want to talk a little bit briefly about, with the CPP program, what would be the universe of regulated entities in the program. And as Colin mentioned this, we do have these two approaches that we're using for the climate protection program. So again, we have the emissions cap approach, which is really going to be tackling the emissions associated with fossil fuel combustion. So these are our emissions that are associated with the natural gas combustion, but also the emissions associated with our other fossil fuels. So specifically gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and propane. And then we do have a second approach, that more site specific, what we're calling the best available emissions reduction approach. And that's really to tackle some of these remaining emissions at our stationary sources. So this would include any kind of natural gas combustion that's due to interstate pipeline, but also industrial process emissions and any potential solid fuel combustion. So like, for example, coal. So again, just in terms of the natural gas combustion emissions, our point of regulation, as we've talked about in the past, is going to be those 3 natural gas utilities that we have in the state of Oregon. For the suppliers of our other fossil fuels, those are going to be the companies that are bringing those fuels into the state. And again, we've talked about this previously, and one thing we did want to update the commission on was, as we've been talking to the RAC and as we're preparing to put out the proposed rule, we have shifted some of our thinking on what should be the way we regulate these fossil fuel suppliers, those who bring those fossil fuels into the state. So we had originally discussed a 200,000 metric ton threshold, and we are now basically proposing a declining threshold over time. So just to step back a minute and to kind of explain the thought process behind this, we have a very dynamic marketplace for our non-natural gas fuel suppliers. We do have we have a few companies that are actually responsible for a majority of the emissions. They're the folks who bring in the most of these fossil fuels. Then we have some relatively smaller companies who have a smaller supply of fuels, but there are more of them. And what we've seen in this market is, emissions can change from year to year, and the quantities of those fuels that are brought in can change from year to year. So in terms of thinking through this threshold, we started at a high threshold because we thought, okay, this is going to capture a significant amount of these emissions, and there's going to be a smaller number of affected entities. And if you look at this chart, you can see at that 200,000 threshold, we're covering about 89%, 90% of these emissions, and that's being covered by about nine regulated entities. But we did have a lot of conversations with our stakeholders, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. There was a lot of attention and feedback provided to us that we should think through ways in which we can cover a bigger slice of these emissions. But again, we wanted to balance that with the fact that some of these relatively smaller entities might need a little bit more time and a little bit more assistance in preparing themselves for this transition. So where we have settled right now, and of course, we're still working on the proposed rule, and we'll surely hear a comment on this, but just to update the commission, where we are right now on this is we are thinking of proposing this declining threshold. And what that means is for that first compliance period, so 2012, 2013, 2014. And again, just to be clear, we are proposing 3-year compliance periods. That threshold would be at 200,000. And then in the next compliance period, which would begin in 2025, 26, and 27, that would lower down to 100,000 metric tons. And that means we'd be bringing in more of these entities, and we'd be covering a slightly higher percentage of total emissions. And then in our third compliance period, which would be 2028 to 2030, we would again drop it down to 50,000 metric tons. And again, that would bring in a few more of these entities. And again, we think that would cover a little bit more of these emissions. And what we're currently proposing is in the fourth control period, which would be 2031, it would drop one more time to 25,000 metric tons, and we would stay at that. So over time, we would be bringing more of these folks into the program. And over time, we'd be increasing just a little bit each time, but we would be increasing the share of emissions that are going to be covered under the program that we could tackle under the climate protection program. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So I just talked about the fact that when we're thinking of the emissions cap and the emissions limit, we're thinking of our natural gas utilities and these fossil fuel suppliers. So one of the questions for us, and one thing we did want to talk to the commission about today and spend hopefully some considerable amount of time on this, is how's this cap really going to work? How are we going to reduce the emissions over time? And one of the questions for us, and we've been talking to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee about this, is where do we start the program? And we're calling that the base cap. And really what that means for us is this would be the starting emissions cap, the starting emissions limit for the first year of the program. And that would be for us 2022. So again, all those entities that I just discussed, what would be their overall limit on emissions? And then going into the future, how would we reduce those emissions over time? And how we therefore calculate an annual cap? So we did have some questions and lots of conversations about how we should compute the base cap. And the reason we did want to spend some time with this is most of the time when we're talking about our GHG emission reduction goals, when the state is talking about reducing emissions, we're talking about 1990, right? Reduce emissions 80% by 2050 by 1990 levels. You know, for us working at the Climate Protection Program, we don't have detailed data by entity as far back as 1990. Yes, there is the statewide inventory and that information is available from 1990, but the actual reported data, so all the great work that's being done by our reporting team and all the great work that's being done by all these entities and their reporting, that work really began in 2010. So 2010 through now, we have this actual reported data through the GHG reporting program. And then prior to that, we don't have as much specific granular data by entity. So we were trying to balance the fact that we do think it's important to use the reported data. And we had a lot of conversations with our rulemaking advisory committee about this. And one of the reasons that we do think this is important is because ultimately for these entities that are going to be covered under the program, and ultimately for us, as we're trying to figure out how we can actually track emission reductions through this program, we're going to be using that reported data, right? That reported data is going to inform the thresholds. That reported data is going to tell us this is how many compliance instruments we're giving. And then all our regulated entities, they have to say, okay, these are my emissions. This is the number of compliance instruments I have to equal those emissions. And when we see those total numbers, we'll know our total emissions reduction. So again, we're using that reported data to make sure this program is working correctly. And again, our regulated entities have been using this program for quite some time to be accurate in how they report their emissions. So we did think in talking to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee that that was an important consideration when thinking about the base cap. And we did hear, I think we heard from a lot of stakeholders and from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee that they did think it was very important to use the actual reported data. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. But I did want to just take a moment to talk about the fact that, again, we do recognize that, you know, the goals are usually based on these 1990 goals. You can see here just to orient the commission again, you know, this is the statewide emissions inventory. These are the numbers from 1990 and the more recent numbers. So you can see, of course, that there are changes in the statewide inventory number. Again, we know that there's a lot of interest in the 1990 number, and we do want to acknowledge that. But again, we did talk considerably, and we did hear a lot about using the reported data to inform our sense of how to construct the base cap. And I'm just going to move quickly to the next slide. So similar to what we just heard from Director Whitman, you know, of course, the Climate Protection Program is going to be a significant way in which the state is going to meet overall objectives for reducing emissions. But it's not the only way, of course. And so one thing we did want to, you know, basically talk to the commission about is, you know, what role is Climate Protection Program going to make in terms of the overall state inventory of emissions? And so you can see here that, you know, this is significant. You know, if you look at the statewide inventory, and you look at each of these years, you can see these numbers are very high, like 47, 48, 40%. So the scope of emissions that potentially are going to be regulated under the Climate Protection Program are going to be incredibly important to statewide goals. But again, as we just heard from Director Whitman, it's not going to be the only way in which the state's reducing emissions. And again, we heard this from Matt in the last session, and again from Director Whitman, you know, electricity use is a significant part of the statewide GHG emissions inventory. And we had talked about the fact that we didn't think Climate Protection Program was the appropriate tool for tackling those emissions. And there's going to be other tools for the state to be able to tackle those emissions. I just also want to point out really quickly that there's other design and policy decisions that we're making that also will change, you know, the potential amount of emissions that are regulated through the Climate Protection Program. I just talked about one, which was the declining threshold. If we were to toggle between this chart and the next slide, you would see the percentages change based on the threshold that we established for the fossil fuel suppliers who are not natural gas utilities, because the lower the threshold, as we talked about, the more that we're going to be able to cover that scope of emissions. So I did want to just kind of step back and give a little bit of a context of the Climate Protection Program within the statewide inventory goals. And then I just wanted, if we can go to the next slide, we can skip over this slide, Stephanie, just to save time. I will just say quickly, you know, in those two previous slides, you did see a percentage for 1990 that was attributed to the Climate Protection Program. But to be clear, we sort of just came up with an assumption for like, if you took the same percentage from the more recent reported data and you applied that to the 1990 statewide inventory, this potentially would be the percentage of the 1990 statewide inventory that would be covered by a climate protection program. So for those folks at home or for our commission, if you're looking at these slides again and you see those numbers in the 1990 statewide inventory, just be mindful that we kind of came up with an assumption to apply a number to 1990, even though we don't actually have the reported data for 1990. Turning more specifically back to the actual climate protection program and how the cap is going to work for us, based on the feedback that we've received from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and the stakeholders, and I'm sure all the feedback we're going to continue to get as we move forward into the proposed rule. Again, currently right now where we are is we are proposing that that 2022 base cap be based on a 3-year average. We're going to use the reported data from 2017 to 2019. Partially that is to mitigate this kind of annual variation. You could see in those other slides that the emissions do go up and down. So we did hear that it would be best to use a 3-year average. Again, we are going to be starting at the higher threshold. So that means we are starting at this 200,000 metric ton threshold for our non-natural gas fuel suppliers. And then we are over time going to be expanding the scope just a little bit, as I said, as we basically decrease that threshold. So we are proposing to make some minor adjustments at each of these step down periods to basically account for the fact that we are bringing in more covered entities under the program. And currently where we are right now, what we think we are going to be proposing, and I'm sure we'll hear lots from the commission and also from the public and other stakeholders when we release proposed rule. But where we are right now is we are basically designing this cap around that 45% reduction by 2035 and 80% reduction by 2050. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a little bit more detail. So what that actually means in terms of numbers, again, as I said, if we take that 3-year average from 2017 to 2019, we have a starting base cap of 28 million tons, essentially. And again, that 28 million tons is if we're at the 200,000 threshold. If we were to have started at a lower threshold, there would be a higher number there because we'd be covering a wider scope of emissions. And again, here you'll see that there is a 1990 number for reference. Again, I'll say, we just came up with an assumption for, if you looked at the 1990 numbers, what potentially would be covered under CPP if CPP had existed in 1990. We don't have this information by entity, but we just sort of came up with an assumption based on average 2017, 2019 emissions, and that the percentage that is of the overall statewide inventory. So just based on that assumption, you could hypothesize that if you use 1990, it might have been a starting point of 25 million metric tons instead of 28 million metric tons. Okay, and then let me just go to the next slide. So again, this is what we are currently proposing to be the actual emissions cap for the program. I will say we are still obviously reviewing all the reported data. We're looking through these numbers. So I do want to flag that these may not actually be the numbers that you see in the proposed rule. One of the things we do have to look at carefully is related entities, because we do want to make sure that we're capturing all the emissions for those entities that are related to each other, even though they might report individually. We are using the complete set of emissions for related entities to determine whether someone would be covered in the program. But based on what we have now and what we're talking about today with the commission, what this would actually mean in terms of a decline in the cap, and we are showing both what I just said, the 45% by 2035 and the 80% by 2050. But for reference, we are also showing how the numbers would be different if we were to instead propose 50% by 2035 or 90% by 2050. So again, the way this would work in practice is in 2022, we'd be looking at 28 million tons. That would be that limit. And then we would decline down. And you can see in 2035, we'd be down to about 17 million metric tons if we were to do 45%. And by 2050, we would be at 6 million metric tons. So again, that would be like the CPP portion of the overall statewide inventory in 2050 if we were to propose an 80% reduction by 2050 to the 2022 cap. Now, I was going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the community climate investments and then talk also about but I did want to stop there to Chair George's suggestion if there were any questions or comments on just the cap setting. Okay, great. So I'll do next slide. So we have talked about the community climate investments in previous commission meetings, and it seems that we always talk about this because there's always a lot of conversation and we get a lot of great feedback from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee on this. So we did want to update again the commission on some of where we are now as we're getting ready to release the proposed rule. Just very quickly again, the community climate investments, it is, what we call an alternative way for our regulated entities to comply with the program. Basically, our covered fuel suppliers could invest in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and in return, they receive a CCI credit, and that CCI credit is generally equivalent to one compliance instrument. They are limited, the fuel suppliers, they are limited to only being able to use CCI credits for about 20% of their total compliance obligation. And again, we have a whole process, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And the way the process works is DEQ will certify these CCI third-party entities. We're going to certify those third-party entities in consultation with an equity advisory committee. And essentially those third-party entities, they're the ones who receive the funds from the fuel suppliers, and they're the ones who implement the projects. But then DEQ is the one who basically gives to the fuel supplier the CCI credit. I know it's not on this slide, but we will be establishing one price for all CCI credits. So for the fuel suppliers, they pay that one price and they receive one credit. And we've talked about this before, but we are proposing that price be based on the social cost of carbon. So what that means at the beginning of the program in 2020 dollars, you're looking about like $76 per CCI credit, and that price does increase over time. If we go to the next slide. These are a couple of areas where in our last few RAC meetings, we have had a lot of active conversation with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, and we have received a lot of comments. So again, we did want to just take a few moments to kind of update the commission on where we are on some of these issues. Again, in terms of the CCI investments, which we get a lot of feedback from, we are still focused on the CCI investments being used for projects that reduce GHG emissions in Oregon. And we are still very much focused on these being projects and investments that prioritize environmental justice and impacted communities, supporting this equitable transition. We have talked a little bit more about the third-party entities themselves. We wanted to be clear, and we received a lot of feedback that even though DEQ will be certifying these third-party entities with the Equity Advisory Committee's consultation, we do anticipate that these third-party entities will be working with other project partners and they will be subcontracting. There will probably be multiple projects that a third-party entity would be implementing, and they might be using other partners to implement those projects. So we also wanted to be clear that the third-party entity that's certified by DEQ does have to be a 501c3 nonprofit, but we currently are not proposing that the project partners need to be. So the project partners themselves, some of the subcontractors that the CCI entity might be using to support these projects, or maybe even support some of their work, they could be private consultants, they could be other for-profit companies. And again, one of the things that we did hear a lot from our most recent conversations with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee is we did get a lot of feedback on the Equity Advisory Committee itself. And really, we're going to have to be very mindful about prioritizing membership from multiple regions of Oregon, multiple areas of expertise, interest, and lived experience, and multiple communities around the state of Oregon. And the only other thing that I wanted to spend some time on, I'm trying to be mindful of time here, in relation to the community climate investments, next slide, please, is, we have heard a lot of feedback on the Cci emissions reductions. And the reason we do want to spend some time with the commission today is we know it's absolutely critically important that the CCI projects reduce emissions, right? Essentially, the way this works is for the regulated entities, this is an option for them to reduce emissions someplace else instead of reducing emissions under the climate protection program. So we really have heard from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and a lot of stakeholders that we need to be very mindful of the fact that these emissions reductions really have to occur and that we have accurate tracking of them. And so we have a couple of newer things in the rule as we're preparing it that are going to really focus on the emissions reductions of the CCI projects. We do want to be absolutely clear that we will be asking third-party entities to propose how they're going to be estimating emissions. We're going to look at that. We're going to see if we agree with them. If we think that their methodology needs to be revised or changed, we would do that. And we are going to be asking these third-party entities to report annually on the emissions reductions that they achieve. So if they say to us, hey, this is a 4-year project, they're still going to have to report to us every single year. And every single year, they're going to have to report to us on how many emissions reductions they're achieving and how many emissions reductions they think they're going to achieve in the future as the project continues. The other thing that we are still working on and getting a lot of information back and still reviewing comments from our rulemaking advisory committee is we do have a program review in the proposed rule. And even though the program review is about the entire climate protection program, we do want to emphasize that we have focused a lot of that program review on the community climate investments. And one of the things we've very much heard is that we need to ensure that, if we give 10 CCI credits out, like if we've awarded 10 CCIs, on average, we should have a total of 10 tons of emissions reductions, right? So we may not have the same emissions reductions for every project, but if we've awarded 10 credits, we would like to see 10 tons reduced. And that's what I think on the slide, if it's the next, on the slide, I think it's underlined as importance of 1-to-1. So we will sometimes use that terminology 1-to-1, 1-to-1. And what we mean is on average, you should be able to get 1 ton of emissions reduction for each CCI credit. And so we do want to be clear that we are going to report to the EQC on the CCI every 2 years. We're going to report on the total number of credits issued and the overall GHG emissions reduced. We're also going to report on other pollutants that are reduced as part of the CCI investments, because as we talked about, co-pollutant reductions are also really important. And we're also going to report on how impacted communities are being invested in. So we will be explaining to the EQC if we are achieving that 1-to-1. And that way the EQC can give us feedback and we can think about ways in which we might change CCI implementation moving forward so that we can ensure they are these emissions reductions. I'm going to stop there and just see if there's any questions on community climate investments.
Vice Chair Barrasso.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Chair George. I appreciate saying this, and I'm just there's a time lag that I'm just trying to reckon with. That I'm assuming you're expecting some entity to have an obligation at the start of the program, and where we don't have CCI sort of banked or created, and so just how are you thinking about reckoning with that, because that time lag as the program starts is going to really, I don't know when, once we sort of say the program starts, when folks are going to be required to prove their emissions reductions. And so just how are we thinking through that initial, really the initial probably first couple of years of compliance periods or whatever else?
Yeah, that's a great point, Vice Chair. So for the regulated entities, once they make that contribution, they receive the CCI credit. But you're right, like the projects haven't been implemented yet. It's over time that the project will be implemented and we have to track the emissions reductions. So the advantage of that, obviously, for our regulated entities is, hey, if I need CCIs at the end of that for my first compliance period, again, we do have a 3-year compliance period, so people won't be obligated to demonstrate compliance until, until the, for the 3rd year of the program. But for our regulated entities, they'll be able to purchase those CCI funds pretty soon. Once we have those entities certified in the program, let's say that takes some time to get up, they will be able to purchase those CCI credits. And once they have those CCI credits, they get to use them for compliance. But on the back end, we have to take those projects and we have to continue to track the emissions reductions as those projects are being implemented, because that's how we actually ensure that there's going to be these GHG reductions to the program.
Director Whitman.
Yeah, real quickly, just to supplement what Nicole just said, the first time when regulated entities will need to show compliance is actually, and Nicole, correct me if I get this wrong, but it's 2024 or 25. Mm-hmm. So Vice Chair Barrasso, there actually is a time period. So during that 3-year time period when entities are determining what their compliance requirement is going to be for the first period, there will be some time for CCI third-party entities to be in programs and projects to be set up.
Chair George, if I could just elaborate a little bit further still, I just want to, and I'm maybe getting out a little over my skis here because we haven't implemented this program yet, but I think Vice Chair Barrasso raises a really good point about it, particularly at the outset of the program, when we are working to set up all the machinery for the community climate investment piece, working to establish our advisory board, working to identify our third parties. If in those early years, in the first couple of years of the program, our regulated parties are using the CCI piece, meaning that they are opting to pay that price to receive the additional community climate investment credits. I suspect we won't have had time to have all that machinery, as I put it, in place and the programs identified and the programs being realized. So if the CCI part of the program is being utilized by the regulated community early on in the program, I suspect we won't have had the opportunity to make all those investments and be already showing a 1-for-1, as Nicole put it, reduction achieved yet at that point. That would mean that funds remain unspent, projects or projects remain not fully yet developed, or all the reductions yet realized. So just being honest up front, I think in the early reviews of this program, we may not be achieving that quite yet, but I think, and we'll want to be exploring why that is. Is it for the reasons I'm just mentioning, or is it because we're choosing projects that aren't penciling out very well for greenhouse gas emission reductions? I think we'll need to be exploring the why as well, particularly in those early reviews of the program.
Okay, thank you.
So if we have time, I think the next thing we were going to talk a little bit about was the approach for stationary sources. Are we 3:20 for the end?
Yeah, we're getting awfully close. But
this really quickly, I think we're scheduled to end at 3:20, but Stephanie can correct me if I'm wrong. So I will just briefly talk a little bit about the approach for stationary sources. And again, as we discussed, we are planning to regulate the stationary sources for these emissions that are very site specific. And this would be a direct regulation approach. Again, for these types of emissions, which I referred to a little bit earlier, that they're industrial process emissions, but also potentially some natural gas combustion emissions that are associated just from interstate pipeline, because again, we are covering natural gas, all the natural gas combustion emissions up at the natural gas utilities, but there is a small universe of these emissions that you don't see in the natural gas utilities emissions because they're from interstate pipeline. And then also, like I said earlier, if there's some kind of solid fuel combustion like coal, this is also a way to capture these types of emissions. So again, these are being addressed through the program and there's a plan for them, but they're not showing up in the emissions cap. They are just kind of being addressed in this separate approach. Again, there's a lot of different industries, and I know we've talked about this in previous commission meetings, so I'll just skip through this quickly, but we do think that the universe is probably about 13 sources. It could be 12 or 13, and they would essentially be looking at a universe of approximately like 1.7 million tons. So really just very briefly, next slide. The way this would essentially work is facilities would provide information to DEQ, and they would basically be offering assessments of the available technologies and practices that they would be able to implement to reduce emissions. I think one of the things that we did want to clarify and make sure we mention to the commission as we are talking through this with stakeholders and the RAC is we will be using the information that the sources provide in their assessments, but it's not the only information that DEQ should or could or would use. We're not restricted to just using information that's provided in the assessment, but of course we think it's critically important for the sources themselves to be telling us this is what's happening at our source and here's some of the ways in which we could potentially reduce emissions. So the DEQ will have the ability to, consult independently industry experts. We also talked about the fact that we will need to talk to local community members and local communities that are going to be impacted or near some of these stationary sources. But we also think it's going to be very important for us to understand the relationships between the GHG emissions at some of these sources and also potentially some of the other state regulations that are in place that also reduce other types of air pollutants. DEQ would actually be the one determining the requirements, and we are the ones that would be telling the sources what they need to do and when they need to do it by. Next slide. So again, in conversations with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and stakeholders, I did want to flag, these are some of the questions that we are asked a lot about, and this is a lot of the work that we're thinking of as we're trying to write the proposed rule and we're thinking about the implementation. We are trying to balance maximizing emissions reductions with what could be feasible and what's available at those sources to reduce emissions. We have a lot of questions about how long the actual process of this is going to take, like how long it will take DEQ to actually do these bear assessments and how long it will take for us to make determination. So what's the schedule of decision making and also what's potentially the schedule of implementation? We have a lot of conversations about what resources and information DEQ has to make these type of determinations. And I do want to be mindful that, we have a lot of conversations and feedback on, how, if this will actually reduce emissions. We have to be mindful of the fact that, what could be the potentially overall emissions for these sources over time as we're trying to implement this best available emissions reduction approach. So that's all we really wanted to cover from a policy perspective. I know we're beyond time, so I would just say there are a couple of slides, and we did want to point out to the commission that as part of putting together the proposed rule, we do have to do a fiscal impact statement. We did talk, I can go to the next slide. I won't go through all these slides. I'll skip this slide. So we are working on this fiscal impact statement, and we did talk to the RAC about the fiscal impact statement. We were getting a lot of feedback at that meeting on the fiscal impact statement. And in terms of what we mean by fiscal impact statement or what we're thinking of, we really asked the RAC and we're asking ourselves to consider the fiscal and economic impacts of the proposed climate protection program. And that is the direct fiscal impact on the covered entities themselves. What is the fiscal impact for our covered entities and what's going to be the extent of that impact? We, of course, need to look very carefully as part of the fiscal impact statement is if there are any significant adverse impacts to small businesses. Those we really do have to consider, the direct impacts to small businesses who might be covered entities and how we could mitigate those impacts. But there's also this broader universe of indirect impacts to the public. Again, we're all businesses, we're all consumers of these fuels, and we do recognize that these indirect impacts are also of great interest and of importance when we're trying to think of the impacts of the climate protection program. So those are some of the questions and some of the areas in which we did speak to the RAC, and we got information back from the RAC. And I just do want to say that that is definitely something that will be part of the proposed rule. But I think in the interest of time, I'll probably just stop there, even though I know there's additional information in the slide deck on the fiscal impact statement.
Okay, well, thank you. And, as you mentioned, we do have additional resources available to us and on the links on the website to connect people with the larger work that's being done. But we do want to be sure that we have time for our public forum. So I appreciate everybody being flexible with us on this presentation. So it is now 3:26, and I just want to check in with the commissioners and the director. Do we have any other comments or questions as we finish up this item? No, and we certainly know there's much more coming, and we appreciate the team and the RAC and everybody's work on this. So we are due to take a little bit of a break, and I think that'll be good so that everybody can be ready to be focused on the public forum. I see that some folks are already raising their hands, and we anticipate that there are a lot of folks who are going to want to talk to us about this important work. So commissioners, let's be back here. Can we be back at 3:35? I'm not hearing objections to that.
That was yes for me.
All right, so let's shoot to be back here. at 3:35, and I'm just gonna kind of put myself on mute and turn off video, and we'll see you back all very shortly.
And Chair George, this is Stephanie Caldera, your Commission Assistant. The recording will be paused until you reconvene for public forum at approximately 3:35.
Perfect. Thanks very much. All right. So we're getting ready to hold our public forum portion of this meeting, our general public forum. And so just a few reminders as we get underway, and Stephanie will also remind us of how just functionally we're going to move through this. So during this item, we welcome input and the opportunity to listen to everyone on general environmental and public health related concerns that are relevant to the EQC's work and DEQ's work. And so folks are welcome to comment on just about any item. The only restriction that we really do have are in regard to proposed rulemakings for which the public comment period has occurred and has been closed. And there's a very specific reason for that, because all of the public comment that the EQC reviews and considers needs to come through that public comment process. And so today, there's three particular areas that's important for. Today, we are not going to be able to take a public comment on the proposed regional haze rules, the proposed Title V program fee increases, and the proposed diesel retrofit rules. And that's because those are all on the agenda for tomorrow. And those public comment periods have closed. And so to protect the integrity of that process, we cannot take comment on those three topics here. But other than that, it's fairly wide open. I know that Stephanie is rapidly writing down names as quickly as she can, and we know we have several. How many do we have now, Stephanie?
Thank you, Chair George. This is Stephanie Caldera, your Commission Assistant. Currently, I am showing 31 people who have requested to comment. They've done that by either clicking the raise hand function in the Zoom interface, usually found at the bottom of their participants panel, or they have pressed *9 on their touchtone phone if they're connected only by phone.
Okay, great. And so if everybody had 2 minutes to speak, we would have an hour public comment forum. When we have a very abundant number of people who want to talk, we do also provide the reminder that if somebody has said something and you feel the same way they do, you are perfectly fine to say, I really agree with what Mr. Smith had to say about this. And we will give that full faith and credit without your needing to repeat all of Mr. Smith's words. Also, some people have already sent information and comments to our email, and that is another way to communicate with us. So while we want to hear what you have to say to us, you don't necessarily feel like you have to say every word that you want us to understand as part of your perspective. So with that, I'll just ask everybody to be very mindful of the time warnings. And again, that's just in respect to all our speakers, and so we can hear as many as possible. So Stephanie, why don't you just quickly review how it is we're actually going to move through this, and we'll get underway.
Thank you, Chair George. As Commission Assistant, I will be unmuting the line of the person who is to speak next. You will be announced by either your Zoom display name, or if you are on phone, the last 4 digits there of your displayed phone number. On screen, I'm going to click through them right now for display. You will see some slides. Green means go. Please state your name when you begin. At 1 minute remaining, you will see this yellow slide, and I will attempt to provide verbal note of that. And at 15 seconds remaining, you'll see this red slide. I will attempt to provide verbal note of that as well. At the end of your 2 minutes, I believe is the allocation, you will see this slide that says, thank you. And with that, Chair George, when you are ready to begin, I can call the first commenter today.
Yes, let's begin.
All right. Well, thank you. Today, first commenter is Kathy Moyd.
Welcome.
Hello, this is Kathy Moyd, speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Oregon. We acknowledge that you will have a difficult task to implement a meaningful climate protection program under many constraints. In addition, there is less than a month between the planned approval of the rules by the EQC in December and the required start of the program in January 1st, 2022. As we said in our written comments provided prior to this meeting, we have been disappointed in the lack of detail regarding the program elements in the draft rules presented so far. In addition, there are some options we hope will be changed as a result of the public review. Therefore, we were disappointed on Wednesday to learn that because of the short time until implementation, the PUC is asking its regulated natural gas utilities to proceed with modeling using the draft 2 rules for the climate protection program. One of our main concerns with the current rules is that the fact that the compliance instruments can be used indefinitely. And then we saw at the last meeting in draft 2 that the community climate investment credits are also usable indefinitely. In addition, a covered fuel supplier is allowed to buy CCIs up to half of its compliance obligation at a higher number and lower price than later in the program, meaning those above the 20% usage limit will have to be banked. Making early reductions greater than required of buying excess CCIs will allow a covered source to use the bank CCIs and CCIs to avoid having to reduce emissions and therefore be above the limit at the end of the program. In addition to the following the CPP, I was also the only one testifying at yesterday's public hearing for the Cleaner Air Oregon
15 seconds remaining.
Air toxics things, and we're especially concerned with the lack of coordination among the many programs affecting air quality. All 14 of the stationary sources expected to be regulated under the CPP have air quality permits. 5 are on the CAO group 1 and 2 calling list, and additional 3 are in regional haze program. So we strongly support having a consolidated list of air toxics, including greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Stan Dean.
Welcome.
Chair, members of the commission, my name is Stan Dean, and I'm representing Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. We participated in the RAC for the CCP. Through most of the RAC process, we were led to believe that staff did not want to exclude any types of projects and that sequestration projects could be eligible. Then at the tail end of the RAC, we were told that sequestration projects would be excluded. We were shocked, especially since there was very little formal explanation for this change. Sequestration in natural and working lands is a critical part of our path forward to address climate change. And these projects can have a benefit to rural communities that are disproportionately burdened by climate change. They can have substantial co-benefits in ecosystem health and resilience. We ask that you reverse this course on the direction for the following reasons. Excluding sequestration is contrary to the intent of Executive Order 2004 and work of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. CCI program will have substantial funding and sequestration projects should be eligible. We need to keep focused on the larger goal of reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which can be done both by reducing emissions and sequestering. Tools to address both pathways are needed to do the best possible job. The Climate Protection Program is designed to provide benefits to historically disadvantaged communities. Remember the Dust Bowl. Rural areas are impacted, and sequestration is the best way to address those areas. We are also concerned that the CCI program must have integrity. It must be verifiable, real, enforceable, and long-lived. They must be in addition to those that are subject to regulation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. The next person in our speakers list is Susan Watkins.
Hi, my name is Susan Watkins. I'm representing citizens of Yamhill County. In May, Director Whitman provided an update to you about Riverbend landfill, and I would like to update that update. You'll recall that the landfill has been trying to expand for the past 13 years. Last year, the county rejected that expansion. Riverbend appealed to LUBA, and LUBA upheld the county's rejection. Riverbend chose not to appeal LUBA's ruling. Instead, Riverbend closed its doors to all municipal solid waste, other than waste its own waste haulers might bring to it. Waste Management has a hauling contract for northern Yamhill County. Today, the Riverbend asked the county to amend its license to reduce the annual fee and set a fixed term of 20 years. In essence, Riverbend is asking for a private landfill. It would be its own private disposal site for only the waste it collects to be deposited there. And there would be no controls on things like litter, vermin and birds that harm neighboring farms, or noise, or the height, or anything that the county could control as it would if there were an expansion plan. This raises huge questions for the operating permit. DEQ has been kicking that permit down the road since 2009, denying citizens the opportunity to argue for tighter requirements. DEQ has told us several times, however, that once expansion is off the table, DEQ will push to implement Riverbend's closure plan. Riverbend's made clear this morning, however, to the county that it expects to expand eventually. We don't know how full that is now. It told the county it was almost full. It told DEQ it hadn't even started on the final grading plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. The next speaker is Dan Sears.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair George, members of the commission. I want to draw your attention to a comment letter submitted last week at the end of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. The comment was submitted by representatives of Road Climate Verde, the Native Youth and Family Center, NAYA, the Coalition of Communities of Color, Columbia Riverkeeper, the Power Pass Frack Gas Coalition, and Earth Justice. I also want to say I appreciate the comments offered earlier by Kathy Moyd. Really, the letter boils down the key issues that will come before you in making major decisions regarding the structure and impact of the climate protection program. And staff have presented their perspective already, but I wanted to highlight three key aspects of the program that we are concerned about. One, DEQ is really missing an opportunity to make the program live up to its name because it's exempting the electric sector and fracked gas power plants. Merchant power plants in Oregon are typically fracked gas power plants, and there is a real risk of the program creating a gap in which out-of-state investors could continue to operate polluting fracked gas plants in Oregon at the expense of and burdening the communities nearby. We also think that EQC should go further in regulating all emissions from the combustion of fracked gas. That would require comprehensively regulating fracked gas pollution rather than just focusing on utilities. Finally, the rules regarding stationary sources should protect neighboring communities, and the EQC should be setting an overarching emissions reduction target for stationary sources so that the best available emission reduction technology conversation isn't distracting from the actual goal, which is to bring down the pollution levels. These are big issues, and we really appreciate that the EQC is going to be taking a fresh look at this and obviously taking what the staff have done. And I also want to say we appreciate the hard effort that DEQ staff put into incorporating public comment. I was often a commenter at the RAC meetings, but not an active participant. We weren't on the RAC. And so we appreciate the work that staff did to open that space for more people to participate. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you. The next speaker in our list is Diane Hodiak.
Welcome.
Thank you, Chair George, commissioners and members, and DEQ. I'm Diane Hodiak, Executive Director of 350 Deschutes, who works on climate policy on behalf of about 1,800 stakeholders. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. This is difficult to say, especially in public. I and others have supported DEQ in so many ways. However, their work on the climate protection plan falls significantly short. I join many others who believe that the DE proposed climate protection program is anything but climate protection. How can a climate protection plan exempt the biggest industry polluters from the cap and offer so many exemptions and perverse incentives to select carbon-intensive fuels? The end result of this is to encourage pollution above the cap. DEQ is right to be concerned about the pollution from the bear approach. That is exactly what we expect. The DEQ plan seems to be largely guided by industry. Sadly, instead of leading, Oregon will lag in climate protection. DEQ's CPP offers little protection to Oregonians and even worse, will contribute to increased negative health consequences for vulnerable communities. The CCI program lacks integrity because it does not specify the best practices that should guide CCI selection. The end result could be a sham program where permanent, additional, or verifiable programs are not required. In sum, I am disappointed I cannot support this plan, embarrassed for Oregon's leaders that truly want climate protection, and deeply disturbed that in the midst of a climate emergency that is burning up our state, we have a plan that disregards science and likely will not meet the reduction goals. Truly, we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair George, the next speaker is Pat Dequ.
Welcome. Patty, are you with us? All right, Stephanie, let's move on to the next person and we can give Pat a try after that.
We will return. The next person who I have listed in the speakers list is, it was Sam Bayer, who unfortunately I no longer see in the speakers list. So I'll put a note and we'll return if that person can comment later. And we will go to Kellen Belcher, please.
Hi there, this is Kellen Belcher speaking on behalf of the Environmental Defense Fund. EDF is here representing our thousands of members in Oregon, as well as our members around the world who have very high hopes for Oregon's potential to be a leader in fighting the global climate crisis. But we join so many of the voices you have heard today in having strong concerns about the proposal for the CPP that DEQ is developing. Our concerns are too numerous to cover in this forum, so I will just focus on a few elements. First, that DEQ's current proposal was not designed with a clear intent to achieve the minimum 2035 and 2050 climate targets in Governor Brown's 2020 executive order, much less the likely even more ambitious mitigation that science tells us is needed by 2030. In part, this is because of exemptions DEQ has made from the program's climate limits or cap. The current proposal leaves a huge gap for fossil fuel electricity generated in Oregon and exported out of state, which creates inexcusable equity concerns and leaves emissions unregulated. And DEQ is talking about regulating industrial sectors through a bear approach, but we fear this regulation will be meaningless if industries are the ones determining what reductions they are capable of, and if industrial emissions are exempted from GHG limits as they are in the current proposal. Finally, DEQ is providing a false choice between community climate investments and creating a firm declining limit on GHG pollution. Our analysis shows that the CCI proposal could allow entities regulated under the cap to pollute at BAU levels through at least 2028. Oregon communities deserve investments in healthier air and a safer climate, but it is unconscionable to create that opportunity only at the expense of real climate progress. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. If we may go back to Pat Dequ, I will prompt that line to unmute and we will see if that commenter is able to provide comment at this time.
Pat, can you hear us? All right. Well, why don't we just again set Pat aside and let's move on with a couple more, and hopefully that they can join us or get unmuted if we give them a little more time.
Thank you, Chair George. At this time, I will go back and I apologize. I missed Samantha Bayer, who I will now prompt to unmute.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hi, sorry about that. So my name is Samantha Bayer, and I'm here today on behalf of the Oregon Farm Bureau to comment on the proposed TMDL rulemaking and to formally request that DEQ convene a rulemaking advisory committee for the TMDL rulemaking that they presented on earlier today. While DEQ has framed these rule changes as minor or inconsequential, we believe that these rules can and may have a potential for significant impacts to agriculture as it relates to their obligations and ability to engage with the development and implementation of TMDLs. The decision to allow TMDLs to be developed under both rule and order will alter the development, implementation, and appeals process for TMDLs. Similarly, DEQ is also proposing to define the term reasonable person, which is not found in the Clean Water Act or Oregon laws that DEQ has begun using to impose direct obligations on special districts and other organizations who do not otherwise qualify as a designated management agency. The decision to formalize this approach in a definition of who should be a responsible person deserves stakeholder discussion and input prior to the agency moving forward with a decision. The Oregon Administrative Procedures Act contains a broad mandate to ensure public engagement in the rulemaking process and strongly encourages engagement of a RAC, particularly for rules that could impact small businesses. For these reasons, we strongly urge the EQC to direct the agency to appoint a rules advisory committee to assist in the development of this rule and the associated fiscal impact statement. Thank you for your consideration, and please let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. The next speaker in the list is Amy Schlusser.
Hi, thank you, Chair George and members of the Commission. My name is Amy Schlusser. I'm a staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I was a member of the CPP RAC. I want to express how important it is for the EQC to take action to reduce fossil fuel emissions in Oregon. As the recent heat waves and wildfires have made abundantly clear, the climate crisis is here. Yet, while we're already suffering from the impacts of climate change, we continue to contribute to the underlying cause of the crisis. Thanks to HB 2021, we now have a framework to phase out fossil fuels from our electric system. But our emissions from transportation and natural gas continue to increase. We can't afford to wait for some future climate disaster to convince us to act. We need to take decisive and ambitious action now. And right now, the Climate Protection Program is the best available tool for reducing fossil fuel emissions from Oregon's unregulated sectors. Are the proposed rules perfect? No. They won't get us where we need to be as quickly as we need to get there, and they won't ensure that frontline communities are protected from future climate impacts and aren't left behind by the energy transition. But the CPP would put us on a path to reduce emissions from transportation and natural gas. The program represents a step rather than a leap, but it's an incredibly important step in the direction we need to go to prevent a full-on climate catastrophe. And while state law prevents the program from providing the kinds of equity protections that exist in other jurisdictions, the community climate investment mechanism would incentivize investments in projects that reduce emissions and provide meaningful benefits to frontline communities. So I urge the Commission to adopt as ambitious rules as possible under the CPP. And I also implore the Commission to adopt the Advanced Clean Truck and Low NOx Omnibus rules, which will help Oregon transition to zero emissions trucks and reduce toxic diesel emissions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tim Miller.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Chair George, Vice Chair Brasso, Commissioners, thanks for the chance to talk today. My name is Tim Miller. I'm the Director of Oregon Business for Climate, and I'm a member of the RAC as well. And I want to focus on two things: CCIs and their implementation and integrity, and leadership, particularly around stationary sources. On CCIs, it's an innovative program. Applaud the staff for coming up with it. It addresses or seeks to address impacted communities. I really appreciate the commitment and expressing the importance of one-to-one connection of emissions reductions. Thank you. But members of the commission, please think hard about the scale of this potential program as you encourage staff to work really hard to set it up very thoughtfully. Vice Chair Barrasso, you know firsthand what it's like to try to stand up a program that pushes $60 million out the door a year. This program could push, by DEQ's own modeling, over $400 million a year out the door. Even if it's not that big, if it's 150, it's going to be hard to do. We need investments for those nonprofits to stand up and be ready to scale to run that. I suggest some financial intermediary nonprofits that help run that as well. It's a bold program. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, though. And we've got a history of having some bold programs that give us a black eye in Oregon. So second one is on leadership. The BEAR approach, unfortunately, I get that it feels attractive to let our stationary sources kind of off the hook. It's going to be hard to reduce emissions. And guess what? This global challenge is going to be hard. Everybody has to take steps. Stationary sources should be under the cap. Our organization believes that there's opportunity in leadership and innovation. The BEAR approach fundamentally says, let's look elsewhere for the best ideas and try to do them here. I suggest we create the ideas here, create opportunity here, create innovation here. Oregon can lead, we should lead. Let's not let our stationary sources off the hook. Let's put them under the cap. Really appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you. The next speaker is Wesley Ward.
Hello, Chair George and Commissioners. I'm Wesley Ward, resident of the Brooklyn neighborhood in Southeast Portland. I live 2/10 of a mile directly west of the UP rail yard. Several months ago at a lecture in Beaverton, I asked an out-of-town professor researcher with expertise in communities dealing with environmental hazards what we should do about diesel pollution. She suggested brightly that we purchase HEPA filters. Not helpful advice if you can't afford several air purifiers or a new HVAC system. Commissioners, I would ask you and DEQ how we are supposed to protect ourselves and our families from diesel pollution and its health effects. Stay inside with windows and doors closed, wait patiently for old diesels to die, and zero emission trucks to appear. I believe my neighborhood will support adoption of the California Advanced Clean Truck and Low NOx rules. But we also need stronger regulations that consider the climate forcing effect of black carbon and that close the loopholes in the 2017 diesel bill. Last year, you denied the indirect source petition. Your decision was a blow to people who live near warehouses, shipping centers, rail yards, and the port, to thousands who live along our major highways, and those who suffer from weakened immune systems and a variety of serious illness that is worsened by diesel particulates, as well as those who care about the climate. Please take a step forward and adopt the two California measures, but please recognize that more needs to be done to deal with existing, slowly aging, heavily polluting diesels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Betsy Herbert.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. My name is Betsy Herbert. I'm speaking on behalf of North Coast Communities for Watershed Protection, a nonprofit with over 700 members. I have a doctorate in environmental studies. My area of expertise is forest management for drinking water source protection. My research analyzes forest practices on the west coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. My literature survey of science articles identifies forest practices that protect drinking water sources. On all counts, the Oregon forest practice rules fall short. The result of Oregon's deficient logging regulations over the past 30 years is that drinking watersheds, primarily in private industrial timber ownership, are heavily degraded, both in terms of water quality and water supply. As timber corporations send logging profits to out-of-state shareholders, Oregon communities are held financially responsible for upgrading their water treatment plants to be able to bring water polluted by logging up to drinking water standards mandated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. For example, after Jetty Creek, after being mostly clear-cut and after numerous water quality violations, DEQ determined that a new water treatment plant was needed. The city of Rockaway Beach constructed that new plant at a cost of $2.4 million, and none of it could be billed to the logging company. Undoubtedly, industrial logging and its weak regulation by Oregon Department of Forestry are responsible for this damage. DEQ cites managed forests, a euphemism for industrial logging, as a major potential contaminating source to the majority of community water systems in Oregon's Coast Range. Oregon now faces a drinking water emergency that will only continue to worsen unless DEQ uses its authority to force ODF to reform its forest practice rules to protect drinking water sources. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Chair George, I would like to see if Pat DeLaQuille, if they are able to present comment. It may be a microphone issue, in which case I do apologize, and I do request that you, if you are able to send a comment, a copy of your comments if we're not able to get you connected today.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, great, great. My name is Dr. Pat DeLaQuille, and I'm an energy expert in energy system modeling and policy analysis related to optimizing emission reduction pathways. I live in Gresham and organize with the Metro Climate Action Team. In my assessment, although DEQ has made some improvements in the proposed rules and its latest updates, the overall ambition of the proposed rules does not rise to the level commensurate with the climate crisis we face as a society. DEQ has shown little ambition with regards to the emission caps. A 2021 base cap of 28.1 million tons based upon the 2017 to 2019 data average is acceptable, but the 2022 first year value should include an incremental decrease from 2021. Most distressing is that DEQ is conflating the base cap, the starting point, and the reference level for the 2035 and 2050 target levels, which should be by basing them on the 2021 base cap and not on the 1990 or 2010 reference levels. With regards to the community climate investments, which is the primary vehicle for both flexible compliance as well as equity for impacted communities, the current draft rule allows covered entities to purchase and bank CCI credits up to 50% of their allowance level, even though only 20% of covered emissions can be offset by CCI credits in any one compliance period. The unlimited banking of such large amounts of CCI credits in the early years of the program results in real emissions exceeding the cap starting in 2020-45 by 3.5 to 4.5 million tons per year. I see no valid reason for allowing such an outcome and strongly recommend that the purchase of CCI credits to bank be no more than 10% and that the stipulation that those bank credits be used within the next 2 compliance periods. I also have concerns about the best available emission reduction approach, although I am encouraged that the EQ is considering third-party expert review as well as public input to the BEAR determinations for every specific facility to ensure accountability. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is V. Pekar.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair George and Commissioners. My name is Victoria Pekar, and I'm the Oregon Transportation Policy Manager at Climate Solutions. And on behalf of Climate Solutions and the Clean Air Healthy Communities Coalition, I urge the Commission to adopt the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and Low NOx Omnibus Rule this November in Oregon. Climate change fueled extreme weather events are already affecting and taking the lives of Oregonians in the form of extreme heat waves, mega fires, and floods. And scientists say that these extreme weather events are boosted by human-caused global warming. This exemplifies the immediate need of government entities to swiftly transition us out of the fossil fuel era. Your commission has the power and authority to make a difference and ensure that Oregon is doing everything we can to not be part of the problem. At the Clean Truck Rulemaking Advisory Committee last week, I heard opposition talking about delaying the adoption of the Clean Truck rules. However, even if the rules were adopted this year, the rules wouldn't even go into effect until 2025. If we wait to adopt the Clean Truck rules post-2021, Oregon will lose an additional year of needed compliance, therefore missing out on a critical time to accelerate ZEV adoption and reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as toxic pollutants affecting our communities now. Another point that a RAC member made was that the cost for electric trucks are too expensive. Today, on a total cost of ownership basis and without incentives, certain zero emission trucks are cost competitive, if not less expensive than their fossil fuel equivalents. New Jersey, currently on track to also adopt California's clean truck rules, just created a voucher pilot program for new medium heavy duty ZEVs. And Oregon has the potential to create something similar to New Jersey's pilot program in the next 4 years to ensure that any electric truck that Oregonian fleets wish to purchase are cheaper or at cost with their diesel counterparts. Securing Oregon's swift and orderly transition to an electric truck future while slashing diesel truck pollution is a public health and climate imperative that can grow the economy and lead to quality jobs. The EQC should use its authority to vote yes in November to promptly adopt the clean truck rules. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Alan Journet.
Chair George and members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Alan Journet, co-facilitator of Southern Oregon Climate Action Now, an organization of some 1,500 rural Southern Oregonians concerned about climate change and eager to see our state address this problem. I've been engaged with DEQ throughout the process and have offered multiple comments on the ideas and concepts presented. After an initial sense of enthusiasm for these efforts, I have become disappointed through the RAC meetings as the program has developed. Currently, as the proposed program stands, I feel that DEQ simply has not developed a program that reflects either the urgency of our global plight or the essence of the governor's executive order. I am particularly disappointed that the program proposed targets less than 50% of the emissions within the authority of DEQ, exempting far too many emissions. The program also excludes stationary sources from the cap and reduce program, despite the executive order directing that these be included. The result is a proposed program that will simply be unable to achieve the goals designated in the executive order or that DEQ claims it will achieve. I am also very concerned that DEQ has adopted a community climate investment proposal that excludes carbon sequestration. We know that carbon sequestration is required if we are to achieve the necessary greenhouse gas goals, yet DEQ excluded these from the only component of the entire climate action plan that can provide funds to incentivize carbon sequestration by landowners and land managers. Rural Oregon is on the front lines of climate impacts and deserves a program that offers incentives to those who seek to adopt carbon sequestration tactics. In addition, the CCI protocol includes no rules that would guarantee either integrity among projects funded by the program or protection for communities potentially compromised by co-pollutants from the corporations seeking CCI credits. Please direct DEQ to include stationary sources within the cap and reduce plan, incorporate carbon sequestration among the CCI options, and develop CCI rules that guarantee integrity and do not generate social injustice. For expanded discussion of these issues, please see the written comments that I have submitted. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Chair George, our next speaker is Jenny Helfrich.
Hi, that's me. You hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. My name is Jenny Helfrich. I'm a senior manager for the state policy program at Cci, and I'm here today to comment in support of the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. So at Ceres, we organize the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy Network. That's a coalition of over 70 major businesses, including a number of health systems, many of whom have substantial operations or headquarters in Oregon. And we also run the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance. That's a collaboration of 24 companies, including Amazon, DHL, IKEA, and others that are looking to completely decarbonize and electrify their fleets. Our companies and investors see climate change as a significant risk and reducing greenhouse gases as an economic opportunity. We strongly support Oregon adopting the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, and we see this as a first of many steps Oregon should take to reduce transportation emissions. So as you know, medium and heavy duty vehicles are a major driver of emissions, and transportation emissions are disproportionately impacting low income and communities of color. Transportation is also a major cost center for our companies. Our Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance is growing, and companies are investing in electrification because transitioning to EVs can generate cost savings over the life of a vehicle. Many medium and heavy duty trucks are already generating cost savings in their electric versions. From the ACT rule you're considering now to the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule to the Low NOx Omnibus Rule, we need strong policies to coordinate industry leaders and stakeholders, increase access to zero emission vehicles, and unlock the savings and cost benefits. This kind of market transformation needs to be driven at a pace and scale that the private sector cannot achieve on its own. That's why our companies band together and work through us to advocate for policies like this. So our companies support electrification of the commercial, medium, and heavy duty transportation sector because it will bring a cleaner, more efficient energy economy in Oregon. And also because increased access to cost-effective zero-emission commercial transportation options helps businesses stay competitive in a market where their customers, investors, patients, students, and employees are increasingly expecting them to lead on sustainability. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Nora Apter.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair George and members of the Commission. My name is Nora Apter, and I'm the Climate Program Director for the Oregon Environmental Council. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today on DEQ's proposed climate protection program rules. I, along with dozens of other climate, environmental justice, tribal, business, and other community members, have been deeply engaged throughout every phase of the CPP rulemaking process, including as a formal member of the RAC. Like many others testifying today, I've provided extensive feedback to help ensure that the Climate Protection Program lives up to its name and succeeds in achieving its stated goals of maximizing emissions reductions, equitable outcomes, and local economic benefits. Most recently, OEC joined more than 20 other organizations, including 10 RAC members, in submitting joint comments expressing our concerns and recommendations for strengthening DEQ's draft CPP rules. Since then, the gravity of this rulemaking again came into sharp focus when extreme heat killed more than 110 Oregonians. Scientific analysis found that the greenhouse gas emissions made the heat wave at least 150 times more likely to occur. I won't recount all of the specific concerns and recommendations outlined in our joint comments, but to summarize, our organizations urge DEQ to revise the draft rules to establish a cap trajectory that is consistent with the best available science, hold major industrial emitters accountable for their emissions, and ensure equity and environmental integrity in the proposed community climate investment program. Given that these perspectives are shared among a diverse representation of RAC and community members, we were disappointed and concerned by the lack of substantive changes in the most recent proposed updates to the rules. I would therefore encourage the EQC to review these joint comments, which we resubmitted to Governor Brown, Director Whitman, Chair George, and the EQC commissioners on July 16th, and direct the agency to make changes to strengthen the program accordingly. The CPP provides Oregon a vital opportunity to demonstrate leadership and make progress in the fight for a healthy climate future, but only if these changes are made. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Janet Lorenzen.
Chair George and commission members, I'm a professor at Willamette University, Janet Lorenzen for the record, and I'm also with 350 Salem. My comments are on the Climate Protection Program. The DEQ has never offered data to you or the RAC that shows the tons of emissions that they have statutory authority to cover, but that they have decided to exempt from this program. The EQC should request that data now because the public during their comment period certainly will. No environmental group has okayed a program target in 2035 or 2050 based on 2010 data. Estimates should be made, just as they were in the slide deck today, for 1990 levels in order to fulfill the executive order. The Climate Protection Program, as it is currently written, fails to prioritize early emissions reductions. It rewards companies for using biofuels like renewable natural gas by allowing them to pollute more, and it essentially creates a loophole for consumer-owned utilities and or merchant fracked gas power plants to get out of regulation altogether. We need to keep this big picture in mind. Holding industrial stationary sources accountable matters in protecting both community health and the climate. DEQ moved industrial process emissions out from under the cap with no specific emission reduction goals and no third-party audits of actual emissions reductions. This needs to be fixed before the program goes forward. Currently, the rules also say to prioritize disproportionately affected communities, but there are no safeguards in rule language to make sure that that happens. At least 50% of community climate investment projects should go to disproportionately affected communities. Also, industry should not be allowed to choose which program their money goes toward, which they are currently allowed to do. If all covered entities bought 50% CCIs in the first compliance period, how many CCI projects would actually be necessary? We haven't actually seen these percentages translated into the raw data so that we can understand better these expectations. If there's a lot of projects needed right away, it could create a lag for when emissions reductions happen, or in the worst case scenario, blow the cap beyond 20%. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Bob Yunka.
Hello, my name is Bob Yunke. I am speaking on behalf of Elders Climate Action. We're an organization of mostly grandparents who are committed to trying to preserve a livable planet for our grandchildren. And I want to focus on one aspect of the CPP that we think is the most egregious deficiency in the plan to date. The climate crisis is clearly upon us. We know that the heat caused hundreds of deaths just last month. What we haven't seen a lot of press on is that last year, the smoke pollution, by best estimates, killed many hundreds of people. We're seeing a massive increase in fire. The average fire has expanded tenfold over the last 10 years, from about 180,000 acres to 1.2 million acres last year. The projections from OSU are that this will double again to 2.5 million acres. And if this continues over the course of the decade, we're going to see 25% of the state of Oregon burned by 2030. So what's missing here is front-end emission reductions that are comparable to the targets that were set by the scientists at IPCC, who called for a nearly half reduction of the emissions by 2030 in order to save the planet. The program, as it currently stands, is proposing to regulate 33 million tons. That means bringing the reductions down by 15 million tons by 2030 to meet the IPCC targets. And the plan as drafted doesn't even do half of that. So we are far short of what is needed by the science to protect the planet and to protect Oregon and its citizens. And we would ask you, the first thing we would ask you is to demand from DEQ a program that will at least achieve the targets recommended by the IPCC.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sarah Wright.
Good afternoon, Chair George and members of the Commission. I'm Sarah Wright, Transportation Program Director with Oregon Environmental Council. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I join the other members of the Clean Air Healthy Communities Coalition in asking you to promptly adopt the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and Low NOx Omnibus Rule. Oregon Environmental Council has been working at the intersection of public health, transportation, and clean air for years. We're eager to see EQC take strong action to continue moving Oregon toward a healthier zero emissions future. Together, the two clean truck rules are an important opportunity to build on DEQ's ongoing work to clean up and phase out polluting diesel engines in favor of zero emissions trucks, buses, vans, and more. Taken together and immediately, the rules will make a real difference in Oregon communities now and into the future. We strongly encourage the Commission to use its authority to secure an electric, medium, and heavy-duty vehicle transition for Oregon by passing the Act and low NOx rules to improve public health, reduce climate pollutants, and open opportunities for green job growth. We urge you to move decisively to adopt these rules this year. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sergio Lopez.
Thank you. Appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak. My name is Sergio Lopez. I am the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Coordinator at Verde. I am not only here on the behalf of Verde, but also in representation of the Coley neighborhood in Northeast Portland. And involvement with all the environmental work that we do, air quality and people's health is a priority in our fight for good. Verde serves as communities by building environmental wealth through social enterprise outreach and advocacy. Our theory of change is that sustainability can be reinterpreted as an anti-poverty strategy. Since 2005, Verde has brought environmental infrastructure to low-income neighborhoods, engaged residents to design and implement these projects, and ensured that environmental investments contribute to community well-being. Transportation is a component of that work, and it is a source of toxic pollutants that are being exposed into our neighborhoods. With that being said, we are here to endorse and support the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and Low NOx Rule, for it aligns with our mission in which it can mitigate our hazardous air pollutants in the neighborhood and in Coley. Doing nothing to accelerate the adoption of clean trucks is an environmental injustice. People with low income, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately burdened by the public health crisis of diesel pollution. Due to racist public policies like urban renewal districts, redlining, and white flight, low-income Oregonians and communities of color are more likely to be located near toxic concentrations of diesel pollution found in busy trucking corridors, distribution hubs, and seaports. That is the Coley neighborhood. It has strong rural elements such as large lots, unpaved and meandering streets, and low density. Coley includes the most racially and ethnically diverse census tract in Oregon and is largely zoned industrial. Columbia Boulevard and Northeast Lombard Street run through the Coley neighborhood and are a main artery to the medium and heavy duty trucks. Trucks, buses, and delivery vans pump out 45% of smog pollution from transportation, yet they're only 10% of the vehicles on the road in the United States. Clean trucks, buses, vans are Oregon's transportation future, and we must accelerate the transition from polluting diesel engines to affordable, reliable, zero-emission EVs to protect our health and improve equity for all, specifically for low-income neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is April Snell.
Hi, for the record, I'm April Snell, Executive Director with the Oregon Water Resources Congress. Thank you for your time today. OWRC for shorthand is a nonprofit trade association representing irrigation districts, water control districts, water improvement districts, drainage districts, and other local government entities delivering agricultural water supplies. These water stewards operate complex water management systems, including reservoirs, canals, pipelines, hydropower facilities, and they are charged with delivering a quantity of water to farmers and ranchers around the state. These entities are actively improving their infrastructure, including piping and other efforts that improve water quality, as well as water conservation and efficiency. I am here today to comment on item D, the informational item TMDLs by rule, which you heard about earlier from DEQ staff, as well as Ms. Bayer from Oregon Farm Bureau. Our association has similar comments as Ms. Bayer that I won't repeat, but I will highlight a few additional elements, which is that we are formally requesting that there is a formal rules advisory committee appointed for this rulemaking, and we have concerns about the inclusion of responsible person in this rulemaking, which, unlike the other conforming definitions, responsible person is not a current term in Clean Water Act, EPA, or under Oregon law. There is significant disagreement about that term's meaning, applicability, and legal ramifications. And in fact, I believe there is pending litigation on related matters. Aside from our difference of opinion on the applicability of this term to our members, it is glaringly inappropriate to include this term in a rulemaking without stakeholder input and formal discussions. We formally request that a formal RAC be appointed for the Division 42 rulemaking to ensure that impacted stakeholders, including our members, are able to engage in a transparent and accountable process. As someone who was originally asked to be on such a RAC, I am confused and concerned why DEQ would abandon such an important process component, particularly when the primary reason for the rulemaking is to allow TMDLs to be conducted by rule. This should not be developed behind closed doors, and doing so will only perpetuate the fear and paranoia many ag users have about the TMDL process. We remain committed to engaging on this and other water quality matters that impact our members and the state's shared resources, but we urge EQC to direct DEQ to appoint a formal RAC. Thank you for your time. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker in my list is Patricio Portillo, but unfortunately that name does not have a phone associated with it. So at this time, I'm going to move to the next person, but in the interim, if the person who is Patricio Portillo could indicate by pressing *9 on their touch tone phone, which phone line may be attributed to them. I believe I can merge those audios and will attempt to do so. At this time, however, I would ask that Akash present comment.
Good afternoon, commissioners, and thank you for this engagement opportunity. My name is Akashdeep Singh, and I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. UCS is a national science-based advocacy organization, a member of the Clean Air Healthy Communities Coalition, and proudly supports the EQC adopting the Advanced Clean Trucks and Low NOx Omnibus rules this November. These rules are critical in alleviating the disproportionate environmental and public health effects burdening low-income Oregonians and Oregonians of color. Mobile diesel pollution is significantly harmful to public health, contains compounds known to damage DNA and cause cancer. Adult exposure to diesel pollution contributes to 27,000 heart attacks, 14,500 hospitalizations, and 2.4 million lost workdays each year. Diesel particulate matter can easily deposit deep into lungs, bloodstreams, and this burden is exacerbated by constant climate catastrophes like the recent heat wave that took the lives of over 100 Oregonians. UCS analyses show that in the grid region containing Oregon, a battery electric truck has between 64% and 87% lower global warming emissions than a diesel truck today. The ACT standard is significant and technologically feasible. UCS is ready to work report notes that the availability of heavy-duty electric vehicles, has grown rapidly in recent years, and there are 70 models and counting from 27 manufacturers of electric trucks and buses that are available today or with production announced for the next 2 years. In 2014, 8 manufacturers offered 25 models of electric trucks and buses that were eligible for purchase incentives in California. We encourage the EQC to take the lead from impacted communities to design and implement additional steps to reduce harmful truck pollution. The ACT and low NOx rules are the result of significant and thorough regulatory processes built on a plethora of public comments, detailed economic and emissions analyses, and decades of rigorous research. They are, however, only a start. This is a building block towards a sustainable and equitable future for future generations, and we at UCS look forward to working with DEQ staff and EQC members to ensure a timely adoption of these critical rules. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. At this time, our next speaker is Patricio Portillo.
Hey, can you hear me? Sorry about that. Hey, so my name is Patricio Portillo. I'm a transportation analyst at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments today. And sorry, I couldn't get unmuted before. So thanks for tapping me now. There's a lot of really exciting stuff underway at DEQ and in Oregon. And I wanted to talk about just one item in particular that's not on today's agenda, but it's currently being considered by DEQ, which is adoption of the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the Heavy Duty Low NOx Omnibus Rule, which others have mentioned already. And these rules are really critical complementary policies that will significantly reduce the harmful air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel trucks in Oregon. As I'm sure you're all aware, the transportation sector, which is particularly the medium and heavy duty trucks, are a major source of toxic criteria pollutants like particulate matter and NOx, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And importantly, the communities that are suffering the most from the transportation pollution are the ones that are, intuitively living adjacent to these freight hubs, such as like highways and ports and rail yards, and they're predominantly low income and communities of color. So, these rules are really like the foundation for addressing the harmful and inequitable pollution from the transportation sector. And they accomplish this in two ways. First, the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, that's like your long-term market transformation rule. It requires truck manufacturers to sell an increasing number of zero-emission vehicles over the next 15 years. And this gets at that long-term goal of zeroing out emissions from trucks. And then meanwhile, the heavy-duty low NOx rule, it's that near-term rule that slashes NOx pollution from new fossil fuel trucks that will continue to be sold alongside a growing number of ZEVs. So I'll stop there and just say that I'm looking forward to working with you all on bringing these rules and their substantial public health benefits to Oregon.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. Our next commenter is Patricia Rincon.
Good afternoon, Chair George and members of the Environmental Quality Commission. My name is Patty Rincon, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Northwest Energy Coalition, a nonprofit organization that advocates for clean, affordable, and equitable energy. We appreciate the opportunity to provide public comment and would like to express our support for the Clean Truck Rules 2021 proposal to adopt California's Advanced Clean Trucks Rule and Heavy-Duty Low NOx Omnibus Rules. The Northwest Energy Coalition has been working to increase access to the benefits of various zero-emission transportation options, and we see the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule with the fleet reporting requirement as critical to that work. In addition, we wanted to highlight the benefits of the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule and the fleet reporting requirement as it relates to the electricity sector. As Oregon increasingly relies on electricity as a transportation fuel, proactive planning for this new load is essential to reliably and affordably serve all Oregon residents. The Advanced Clean Truck Rule would support the utility resource planning process by providing a reasonable level of certainty for electric vehicle adoption, which helps electric utilities plan for this new load. A robust fleet reporting requirement would provide data that would enhance utility distribution system planning efforts. This planning is vital in the transition to clean vehicles, as a well-designed grid can lower bills for all customers by avoiding expensive system upgrades that provide fewer benefits. We look forward to engaging throughout the rulemaking process as we see significant opportunities for cross-sector health, environmental, and economic benefits. Thank you for your consideration of the Northwest Energy Coalition's comments.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Annabelle Baldini.
Hi, my name is Annabelle Baldini and I'm 13 years old. The proposed Advanced Clean Truck Rule is important to me because it would cut down greenhouse gas emissions dramatically, which is precisely what our state needs. Transportation is the biggest source of greenhouse gases in Oregon. 40% of the greenhouse gases of Oregon came from airplanes, buses, cars, and trucks. This rule would help the worsening situation of the environment, partially caused by the emissions of those same trucks. Inhaling diesel exhaust has been scientifically proven to negatively impact your health, and since diesel engines produce 25% of all the nitrogen oxide emissions in Oregon, a good way to get nitrogen oxide emissions down would be to transition to a clean truck future. Correction, we need to transition to a clean truck future, or else the high levels of air pollution will just keep getting higher, and people will just keep getting sicker because of it. All this pollution won't just be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, not for me, not for my generation, because we'll be living in this world ravaged by climate change and pollution for the rest of our lives if we don't do something now. That's really scary to me, and I feel really frustrated that so much damage has been done already and that I have to spend my summer days begging the government to please give me clean air to breathe. So the Advanced Clean Truck Rule is a good place to start, a good place to begin the work of getting emissions down and helping the planet. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Sam Kropp.
Hi there, Chair George, Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. Thank you for your time. For the record, my name is Samantha Kropp, and I'm here to testify today on behalf of the Forest Waters Coalition, a network of 19 organizations working to change Oregon's logging laws for the benefit of watersheds, fish, wildlife, and communities. I'd also like to express my support for the words that Betsy Herbert mentioned in her testimony earlier, and to others who are expressing the need for more urgent action in the face of the climate crisis. Oregon's forested watersheds have the weakest protections compared to any of our neighboring states. Our current forest practices allow corporations to clear cut vast areas right across steep headwater streams and within 20 feet of drinking water sources. These practices degrade water quality, harm fish populations, and pollute our drinking water supplies. And in fact, Oregon has been denied millions of dollars in federal funding from the Environmental Protection Agency because of our state's coastal non-point pollution control program, not sufficiently protecting streams from the impacts of industrial logging. And as a result, as others have said and continue to say again, Oregon's communities are facing a drinking water emergency. In fact, our environmental regulators have identified logging, road building, and associated chemical spraying as a threat to more than 170 public water systems across the state. Many communities have contacted the Department of Environmental Quality with concerns about logging in their drinking watersheds, yet too often those requests for help have turned up fruitless. Residents of Rockaway Beach witnessed 95% of their drinking watersheds clear cut in the past 17 years, despite the extraordinary efforts of those community members to protect Jetty Creek, their drinking water source. Other communities like Arch Cape and Corbett have been forced to spend millions of dollars on water treatment because of the harmful impacts of industrial logging. Now, as DEQ enters into a new memorandum of agreement with the Oregon Department of Forestry, we ask that you take on a leadership role in ensuring adequate protections for Oregon's waterways. More engagement and oversight is needed from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and EQC to get our state's forest practices on track. Please advance a strong MOA that empowers the DEQ to enforce clean water quality standards and gives DEQ authority to hold the Oregon Department of Forestry accountable for advancing forest practices that harm our waterways. More than simply ensuring compliance with current inadequate regulations, our state must go above and beyond the baseline to demonstrate leadership in watershed-wise forest practices. Towards that end, we specifically urge you to explore avenues to expand protections for our drinking water sources and support our communities with resources and opportunities to advocate on behalf of their watersheds. Drinking water can't wait. Our communities need allies in the struggle to protect their drinking water. We just ask that you take significant and timely action to ensure that Oregon forest practices meet the federal scientific and ethical standards for clean water. And just to let you know who the members of the coalition are, it's signed by Oregon Audubon Society.
Welcome to follow up with us via email. We do need to let other commenters speak.
Sure, I'll follow up the email. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And I will just ask everybody, if you're on Zoom, you can see how many hands are still up. We really do appreciate these opportunities, but we are significantly over the time we were scheduled to recess. We do want to hear from everybody, but I'm going to ask people to be very mindful of the time frame, and please remember we can be accessible via email. Welcome to the next speaker. Stephanie will announce you now.
Our next speaker is Hugh Lee.
Thank you, EQC commissioners, for having us all here today to discuss this issue of critical importance to climate action and public health. My name is Hugh Lay, and I'm testifying on behalf of the Sierra Club. We represent over 73,000 members and supporters here in Oregon and over 4 million in the United States. It is clear that the state needs to take immediate action this year to clamp down on climate-driven emissions, the largest source of which is from our transportation sector, contributing to approximately 40% of the state's total emissions. Scientists and activists have told policymakers for years that it is time to act on climate. We are growing wary of the phase "the time is now," but I'll stress it again, the time is now. Oregon was one of the first states to adopt California's Advanced Clean Cars program many years ago to reduce emissions from light-duty vehicles and to increase widespread adoption of zero-emission vehicles. We must join California again to clean up our larger vehicles, many which run on diesel and are major sources of harmful air pollutants. There are approximately 4 million total vehicles on the road in Oregon, 200,000 of which are medium and heavy duty trucks and buses that produce dangerous air pollutants that harm the health of our communities, especially frontline communities of color. Here's a shocking reality. Although medium and heavy duty trucks and buses account for only 5% of all vehicles on the road, they're responsible for the bulk of toxic air pollution. They contribute 49% of nitrogen oxide emissions and nearly 50% of the particulate matter produced by the entire transportation sector. This has resulted in approximately 176 deaths, 145 heart attacks, and 25,000 lost work days annually. Oregon has the opportunity to address this. The Sierra Club strongly supports and urges the EQC to adopt the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule and the Low NOx Omnibus Rule. Adopting these rules will accelerate deployment of electric trucks and buses with a long-term standard that requires new sales of zero-emission vehicles to be 100% by 2045, and a near-term standard that immediately reduces 90% of toxic NOx pollution in our communities by 2027. EQC should seek to adopt ACT rule this year and should reject any invitations to delay adoption. Waiting to adopt the ACT post-2021 means Oregon will lose additional years of needed compliance, and we cannot afford that given the ongoing climate crisis and the public health impacts from fossil fuel-powered trucks and buses. Thank you so much for your time and consideration. I look forward to the ongoing collaboration and discussion on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Will Barrett.
Good afternoon. My name is Will Barrett. I'm the Senior Director for Clean Air Advocacy with the American Lung Association. And I'm commenting today also about our strong support for the adoption of the Advanced Clean Truck and Low NOx Omnibus standards to reduce the public health, climate, and health equity impacts of medium and heavy duty truck pollution. Transportation is the leading source of our air and climate pollution burdens, and especially in our lower income communities and communities of color overly burdened by diesel emissions. The American Lung Association's State of the Air 2021 report found that over 600,000 residents are living in communities impacted by unhealthy levels of ozone pollution, and that Eugene, Medford, and Portland all appear on the list of the most polluted cities in the United States due to particle pollution. We know that breathing ozone and particle pollution contribute to a wide range of health impacts, including asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes, and premature death, and that breathing particle pollution can also cause lung cancer. Children, seniors, those with lung and heart illnesses are at greater risks, as are lower income communities and communities of color. In order to reduce the burdens of transportation pollution, the American Lung Association strongly urges the adoption of the Advanced Clean Truck and Low NOx Omnibus standards in November. This really, we feel, spurs real-world emission reductions and accelerates the major public health benefits of the widespread shift to zero-emission transportation. These rules will save lives, they will reduce health impacts, and disparities in exposures to carcinogenic diesel exhaust. We urge your strong support and moving quickly on these rules. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Amy Akoti Oyeken.
Hello, speaker, are you with us?
Okay. Dear Chair George, yes, I'm here. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Dear Chair George and members of the Environmental Quality Commission, my name is Eme Akoti Oyeken. I live in Eugene, Oregon, and I'm the Environmental and Climate Justice Coordinator of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Eugene Springfield Unit. I'm also a Department of Environmental Quality Clean Trucks Rulemaking Advisory Committee member and member of the Clean Air and Healthy Communities Coalition. Here at the NAACP, we understand that environmental injustice, including the proliferation of climate change, systematically impacts communities of color and low-income communities in the United States and all over the world. My work here in Oregon advances the NAACP's national goals to reduce harmful emissions, including greenhouse gases, advance energy efficiency and clean energy, and strengthen community resilience and livability. This is why I'm here today to strongly urge that this commission adopt the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and Low NOx Omnibus Rule this year in Oregon. I recently found out that particulate air pollution, especially from diesel vehicular exhaust, can potentially worsen a condition called systemic lupus erythematosus, a chronic autoimmune disease I was diagnosed with in 2018. The disease disproportionately affects women of color and can affect any part of the body, causing widespread inflammation and tissue damage to the affected organ. Exacerbated by the Pacific Northwest heat wave a few weeks ago, the disease put me in the hospital with severe vomiting, dehydration, and an inability to walk without stumbling. I'm better now, but since I moved into more affordable housing this past weekend, I've been awoken by the loud rumbling of trucks and vehicles just outside my bedroom window. Now I'm here wondering what combination of climate-related weather, my own biological risk factors, and the invisible toxic assailants now seeping into my window will contribute to my next potential emergency room visit. Again, I strongly encourage the commission to use this authority to secure an electric medium and heavy duty vehicle transition for Oregon by passing California's ACT and Low NOx Omnibus Rule. Lives much like mine depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're glad that you're feeling better.
Our next speaker is Becky Lipton.
Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Rebecca Lipton from Springfield, Oregon. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I am responding and commenting as a citizen and as a person concerned about future generations. I've lived in Eugene area since 1999, and in the last 10 years that I've been here, I have witnessed, as you all have been witnessing, the slow dying of trees in the Willamette Valley and Cascade Mountains, and increasingly devastating wildfires, heat waves, and hearing about the climate change, weather-related events elsewhere around the country and the world. I urge you to take aggressive action and policy making and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions starting as soon as possible. I understand that the Department of Environmental Quality and the Environmental Quality Commission want to exempt top polluters in the state of Oregon, such as fracked gas power plants and other fossil fuel intensive polluters. And this absolutely cannot happen. You must include all polluters in your policy making to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you very much. Please do the job that we have you there for.
Thank you.
And thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Maddock.
Hi, I'm Michael Maddock. I live in Eugene. I'm a retired WRD watermaster. I first want to thank you for attempting to carry out this difficult task. I mean, especially for the staff. I used to write a lot of rules, and boy, my hat's off to you. Anyway, I want to second the comments by Dan Sears, Kathy Moyd, Kellen Belcher, Amy Schlusher, Tim Miller, Pat Dillaqua, Victoria Pekar, Alan Journay, Jenny Helfrich, Nora Apter, Janet Lorenzen, Bob Yunker, Sarah Wright, Sergio Lopez, Ashgar Patricio Portillo, Patricia Rincon, Becky Lipton, Annabelle Baldini, and Samantha Kropp. Just a couple of points. I would say, as I read this proposal, it seems that starting in 2022, polluters would have 3 years to sort of do something, and in 2025 they could buy some CCIs that might result in a decrease in 2028. But you know, if it doesn't, you're sort of still at the starting point in 2029. Now, I might not be seeing that accurately, but that's sort of how it looks. Also, as I understand it, you're not addressing methane leaks from fracked gas, which is a real concern to me. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Ramsey McPhillips.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Chair George and Commission members and Stephanie. It's Ramsey McPhillips, representing the many farmers in Yamhill County still living under the menace of Riverbend landfill's expansion. Earlier, Susan Watkins brought you up to date on the current situation with the landfill legally and what's going on in the county. I've waited decades for this day for the landfill to close its doors, and pretty much in the cover of darkness, it did. We were told repeatedly that if we got to this day, the Department of Environmental Quality would finally issue a closure permit or require one of Riverbend landfill. So I'm on here today to ask you to immediately instruct Director Whitman to require Riverbend landfill to file the closure permit. To let this go on any longer would be disingenuous to the multitude of entities that have fought and won to save the farmland, tourist industry, river, and economy of Yamhill County. Since Riverbend closed its doors unexpectedly 2 weeks ago, there has been no notable increase in garbage rates or disruption in garbage services to the service area. Further proof that one of Oregon's biggest methane-creating leachate violating environmental mistakes is not a necessary evil. Many of Riverbend's previous disposal clients have moved on to other facilities in the gorge. This is very important for me to state to you and to remind you, let us never forget that this facility, Columbia Ridge, was built specifically by Waste Management in an offer to Metro and the state to avoid farmland destroying landfill creation and expansions in the Willamette Valley. Waste Management has another landfill to take their garbage and conduct their business. The farmers, the river, the airshed in Yamhill County do not have other environmental atmospheres to live on. It's time that you issue the closure permit as promised, because we've brought you the legal land use decision, which is final, on a plate. Thank you so much, and I hope you will act.
Thank you. We're going to take just a moment. Vice Chair Barrasso, do you have something that you would like to share?
I just wanted to acknowledge, and apologies, I've been off camera as I do have to go to daycare pickup at 5. I'm right outside the daycare, so my many apologies to the remaining commenters, but I just wanted to appreciate everyone, and I will look forward to listening in to the remaining comments. So thank you, and apologies I'm not there, at least on the video with you all. I won't be there the rest of this time. Thank you.
We appreciate that, Vice Chair, and we do understand. We know that everyone has families they need to get home to or other things they need to do, but we will finish up with our last commenters here. So welcome to our next commenter. Stephanie will introduce you now.
Our next commenter is Aranfis.
Hello, Chair George, members of the EQC, and Director Whitman. My name is Ranfis Gentino Vitoro, and I'm with Blue Green Alliance. We are a national organization founded between the United Steelworkers, one of our largest manufacturing sector unions in North America, and Sierra Club on the national level. Our work is to address some of our environmental challenges while creating good quality jobs. So we are a coalition of local environmental and labor organizations. I'm here to testify in support of both the Climate Protection Plan and the Clean Truck Rule, both supporting the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the Low NOx Rule, and support of the fleet reporting requirement. What I'll say in terms of my comments on the Climate Protection Plan is I think we could do better in terms of centering equity in the grant-making process, as well as putting more responsibility in treating allowances and compliance instruments as a public benefit. We would continue to strongly encourage that we consider allowances and compliance instruments as be qualified for only responsible entities. So folks who are following state and federal laws, folks who are good neighbors towards surrounding communities, and folks who are considering their workforce, making sure that they have a good, just transition plan and treating their workforce justly. I think all these efforts combined together are worthwhile and worth our energy and time. This is our version of a space race. It's worth our energy, time, and effort to ensure that we are decarbonizing and making Oregon, creating the path towards decarbonization for the betterment, not just for Oregonians, but for workers, for frontline communities, and for the overall environment. So I will end my comments there and will submit an email with further comments, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Priya Choazam.
Good afternoon, Chair George and Commissioners. My name is Priya Chunzum. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the coordinator for the Power Past Frack Gas Coalition, a group of over 30 organizations working in and around the Pacific Northwest at the intersections of health and the environment. We come together around a belief in the power of clean energy and clear water and organize against frack gas infrastructure that obstructs efforts to build toward climate justice. As stated by the EQC, a primary objective of this rulemaking process is to, quote, prioritize equity by alleviating burdens on impacted communities. As a born and raised Oregonian, Indigenous person, and first-generation American, equity to me means no less than a commitment to fostering more life and less destruction in every single waterway and community, human and not, in this state. But the rules as they currently stand would shield the biggest polluters in Oregon from being accountable to the environmental violence that they enact. frac gas plants would not bear the consequences of their polluting and would instead leave already marginalized local communities to navigate the fallout. The fallout of frac gas plants being in our communities isn't only the emissions they produce. DEQ's modeling will miss the most destructive impacts to Native, Latinx, and other frontline communities if it does not consider the downstream effects produced by frac gas plants. That would be like trying to solve the problem without having first properly diagnosed what exactly the problem is. In addition to emitting greenhouse gases, frac gas plants create other types of pollution, like smog-forming VOCs and cancer-causing particulate matter pollution that aren't usually monitored at these sites. That's in addition to the decimation of our waterways, which is inevitable in the process of producing frac gas. Clear cutting, water contamination, and cutting trenches for pipelines have visceral effects on all living beings that rely on that water to live. To write off these massive consequences is to say that we are okay with communities becoming collateral damage in the pursuit of frac gas. By exempting the biggest polluters in our state, these proposed rules risk perpetuating legacies of environmental violence in some of the most vulnerable communities in Oregon. Truly equitable rules would have positive downstream effects that acknowledge what frontline communities have been saying this whole time, that no one knows better or is more invested in the safety, health, and well-being of a community than the community itself. And it's our job to uplift and honor what they are saying. Thank you.
And thank you, Chair George. The last raised hand I have in my speakers list today is Ilsa Purse.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. My name is Ilsa Purse. I'm with Stop the Dump Coalition in Yamhill County. And I would like to echo the sentiments of Susan Watkins and Ramsey McPhillips. I would also like to add a couple of other comments. In the May director's report that Director Whitman was unable to review at your EQC meeting, he did mention that there was a federal EPA consent order regarding Riverbend's EPA violations. We have yet to see that consent order, and we do not believe the county, Yamhill County, has seen this order either. And we asked the DEQ forward it to the county, since there's always this rather serious information gap between what waste management is up to and what the county is informed about. We're really concerned, as you've heard, that now that the landfill has incontrovertible denial of their ability to expand, the DEQ must step up to the plate. This is DEQ's job. It is not Yamhill County's job, because a landfill is a potential toxic hazard. That is an environmental problem that only DEQ is in charge of. Now that there is no land use permission, waste management has no ability to expand, yet they game the system. They are asking for a 20-year license with Yamhill County, despite the fact they are not allowed to expand and they do not have enough garbage to put in there. The dump is full and they need to be closed down. They seem to think that one day they will miraculously get permission to expand, and that they will then be allowed, that their DEQ permit will come in handy. That's not how it works. It's now. They do not have permission to expand, and DEQ needs to close the place down. Thank you so much for your ongoing attention to this issue. We've been with you for years. We hope we don't have to see you again next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Chair George, no additional names appear on my speakers list for folks to comment during today's public forum.
Thank you very much. And we do appreciate the time that people take out of their busy lives to come and share their thoughts with us. We do know that we have more business that we will resume with tomorrow morning at 8:15. And I do know that some of the issues that have been mentioned that the director is going to have some comments on in the director's report. So we will have some opportunities to address some of these issues. And some will also require other follow-up that we will need to do after the EQC concludes this meeting of the EQC. Again, thank you to everyone. We will now be in recess at 5:05 until 8:15 tomorrow morning. Thank you, everyone.
At this time, we will close the recording, turn off the Zoom, and look forward to seeing people again tomorrow on Friday, July 23rd. Thank you.
Thank you.